Gowri, you can start.
Good evening, everybody. At the outset, I have, with regret, I tell you, to Dr. Chitra Madhavan, who was supposed to deliver a talk today on pace and newness, is due to unavoidable circumstances, she had to call off her talk. Instead, we have a talk by Raamesh Gowri Raghavan on Danish travelers, which we are sure you will enjoy equally. Over the course of next 2 days, we are trying to see if Chitra can come back to deliver her talk. He who returns from a journey is not the same he who left, says an old Chinese proverb. Equally true is the fact that many of these travelers who came to India in the past have left their footprint so firmly here that our own land is no longer the same after their visit. A very warm welcome to all of you on the 4th day of our Indology Festival, titled Wanderers and Witnesses, Travelers' Tales of India. Through 6 brilliant and insightful lectures over the last 3 days, we tried to touch upon some of the ancient and medieval travelers to India and understand what their narratives reflect. Through the course of today's lectures, we'll be slightly shifting focus. We will be concentrating on a group of unique travelers who did not merely travel across geography. They traveled across languages, cultures, and worldviews, and left their imprint on the historical and cultural landscape of India. We begin in one of the quiet coastal towns of Tamil Nadu, Tranquebar or Tharangambadi, where the Danish footprints first encountered Indian soil. It was here that the Protestant missionary Bartholomew Ziegelbart arrived first in early 18th century. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Bartholomew's is one of the earliest and most sincere attempts by a European to engage in a religious and cultural dialogue with India. In fact, Bartholomew's work stands at the confluence of scholarship, faith, and linguistic empathy. By immersing himself in the culture of Tamil Nadu, translating our Tamil ancient religious text, and establishing a printing press here, Bartholomew became a bridge between Europe and India, between belief and understanding. From this quiet coastal town, we move into the heartland of Mughal India through 2 French travelers. We first have Francois Bernier, a physician, who through his rational observations paints a vivid picture of Mughal India. We also have the gem trader, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who gives us a scintillating account of the Mughal courts and also talks about their political intrigue and landscape. Between them, these 2 keen French observers presented to Europe and us a new lens of India, which reflected on the Mughal kingdom, their politics, society, and their cultural and economic riches. Through our 2 presentations today, we will try to understand how many of these travelers who came to India were not merely observers. They were participants in the chaotic historic fabric of India, some as learners, some as critiques, and some as unlikely allies in the writing of its story. As we continue today's exploration, as always, let me give you a brief introduction about Tamil Heritage Trust, which is our organization, especially for the benefit of those who are joining us for the first time today. Tamil Heritage Trust or Tamil Paramparya Arakattalai is a voluntary organization started by a group of like-minded people almost 15 years ago with the objective of understanding, appreciating, disseminating and celebrating information related to India's rich history and heritage, not just for the scholarly and academic minded, but the average enthusiastic public as well. Towards this end, THT conducts several events and programs throughout the year. Chief amongst these are our talks and seminars. We have our monthly Heritage Series talks on the first Saturday of every month, which is an online talk in English. This program has continued almost uninterrupted for 15 years now, merely changing format from in-person to online talks through and post-corona. Then we have a 2-day in-person event conducted in the month of December called Pechu Kacheri or Oratory Concert to collaborate and coincide with the Margari Isai Kacheris of Chennai. Then we have our scholarly and academic event, the Indology Festival, and we are on the 4th day of that. Apart from our talks and seminars, we also conduct several workshops and classroom sessions on and off. We have one-day workshops called How to See a Temple, How to See a Museum, etc., where anybody can register and participate. We also have classroom sessions on Pallava Grantham script, ancient Indian astronomy, ancient Indian mathematics, etc. Alamar Avai, another initiative of ours, targets the school teachers of Tamil Nadu. Through a series of weekend lectures, aspects of Indian history and heritage are discussed, the idea being the teachers take it back to their students, thus further spreading awareness. A relatively new initiative of ours is the docent training, where people are given training to convert them into docents so that they can present historical sites and heritage monuments in a professional manner to the enthusiastic audience. We just finished batch 2 of this training earlier this year and will soon be advertising for batch 3. Site Seminar is an in-house initiative of ours, essentially meant for self-enhancement and self-education. We zero in upon a particular site in India and our volunteers study the same through several weeks. Then we have a number of in-house seminars, and then armed with all this knowledge, we visit these sites and experience it in its totality. From the Tamil Heritage Trust, we also give away 2 awards for individual contributions. The first such award is named after our founder and is called THT Professor S. Swaminathan Heritage Award. This is given for individual contributions in the field of Indian history and heritage. We will soon be advertising and calling for nominations for this award for the year 2025. The second award that we give is called the V. Venkaiah Epigraphy Award. This is given for individual contributions in the field of epigraphy. Named after V. Venkaiah, the first official Indian epigraphist, this award has been instituted by Sunita Madhavan, his great-granddaughter. THT has been entrusted with the responsibility of administering this award. This year, we have already received nominations for this award and are in the process of jury scrutiny. We have a YouTube channel where you will find links to all our past talks, right down to today's talks. You may subscribe to the channel and kindly click on the bell icon to receive notifications of our future events. These are our social media handles and this is our mailing address. You can mail us here to join our mailing list or to collaborate with us in any way in any of our initiatives in a voluntary capacity. We are a voluntary organization with no financial backing, so we'll be very happy to receive any kind of contributions from anybody. You can use this QR code or this address to contribute generously and it will be deeply appreciated. That was about Tamil Heritage Trust. As I already mentioned, we have 2 talks lined up for you today. The first one is called Tranquebar's Long Shadow on Tamil Nadu and will be delivered by Raamesh Gowri Raghavan. The second talk is titled Encounters with India, a la Francaise, Francoise Bernier and Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, to be given by Dr. Faith E. Beasley. Now moving on to the first talk. The Danske Ostindens Company or Danish East India Company was chartered and established by Denmark, Norway to pursue trade with East Indies by setting up a trading post in Tranquebar or Tarangambadi in Tamil Nadu in 1620 and later also in Serampur, Bengal. It existed in two main periods. The first company, between 1616 and 1650, was founded in 1616 and inspired by the Dutch East India Company. It aimed to share in the lucrative colonial trade, but faced challenges from European rivals and local rulers. The second company started at 1670 and went on till 1729. After a period of inactivity, it was revived, benefiting from European conflicts by offering a neutral trading flag. In 1730, the company was re-established as the Asiatic Company, marking a new phase in Danish colonial ambitions with the advent of the mission and its scholarly leader, Bartholomew Ziegenbalg, and stayed on till 1845. In his talk, Raamesh Raghavan will touch upon the various strategies used by the Danes to survive, including privatizing, the slave trade, and the exploitation of various conflicts among the European powers trading within the East, but will focus essentially on Bartholomew Ziegenbalg and his contributions to India. A little bit about Raamesh. With a diverse background spanning science, writing, advertising, and archaeology, Raamesh Gowri Raghavan works as a freelance creative consultant. A faculty in the Archaeology and Epigraphy departments of Institution Trust, Mumbai, he has also taught archaeozoology and paleobotany at the University of Mumbai. With 7 years of experience as a research associate, his academic publications cover topics such as numerical linguistics and the microflora of the Lunar Crater Lake. He has organized conferences and workshops on archaeology, haikai literature, and ancient Indian games. A writer and poet with literary publications, editor of the literary e-journal Narrow Road and Cafe Haiku, conductor of heritage walks in Mumbai and Thane, peer counselor for suicide prevention, Raamesh indeed dons many hats. We are really lucky that foreign travelers is also amongst his interests, and he has taken time from his busy schedule to join us today. And all the more thank you for preponing your talk and filling in the slot today. A very warm welcome to you, Raamesh. I now invite you to take on the screen and deliver your talk.
Thank you very much, Gauri, and thank you very much all the members of the Tamil Heritage Trust. I am sharing my screen now. This is not the intended screen. Here it is. So let's talk about Tranquebar's long shadow on Tamil Nadu through the Danes in India. So this presentation is going to be divided into two parts. The first part will talk about the Danes and their adventures and misadventures in India in general through the Danish East India Company and then the Danish Asiatic Company. And in the second part, I will move on to the life and work of Bartholomew Ziegenbalg. I will stick to the English pronunciation of his name. And to show his lasting contributions to the consciousness of Tamil Nadu. So let's come back. And part one is Vikings in the Bay of Bengal. And let's see why I have titled it this. So the 17th century was indeed an interesting period. The East India companies had been formed for both the English and the Dutch, and soon the others would follow. The Danes, the Swedes, and the French. But the one that created the maximum sensation was the 7th voyage of the East India Company. Okay? The total investment of all its shareholders and directors based in London was about 15,000 something pounds. And the return on investment, so they sent a fleet of ships to India, made a trade and came back and sold Indian goods for a whopping 214% return. Okay, that caused a massive sensation right across Europe, which clearly set up a lot of desire among a lot of European traders in order to go and trade with India. Now, every country, that had a decent sized merchant navy had given uh, to its specific East India Company a monopoly, and there were clearly a large number of merchants who did not want to, tolerate these monopolies. And two of them were Jan de Willem of Amsterdam and Herman Rosenkrantz of Rotterdam. So they wanted to, make money out of the East India trade, but they had to go through the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie of the Dutch, which they didn't want to do. So they made a very radical proposal. They approached King Christian IV of Denmark and suggested that he should form a Danish trading company. Now, this person, his economy at that time was dependent on trade with the Baltic regions and land trade with Germany. And he clearly was very keen on the lucrative East India trade. So he promptly issued a charter forming a Danish East India Company, even though the vessels of that company would essentially be Dutch vessels flying under the Danish flag. Nevertheless, for the Danske Oostindisk Company, as it is known as Danish, it took quite some time to raise the capital needed to put together a voyage. It's only on August 1618 that they managed to send out a scout ship called Ursund under the command of a Dutchman known as Roland Crappe. Roland Crappe was chosen largely because he had a network all over the Bay of Bengal and especially was friends with the Nayak of Tanjore when he had been working with the VOC. Following Crappe came the main Danish fleet. Okay, it had the flagship Elephant with the Admiral Ove Gedde, okay, who was only 24 years old, and his chief qualification was that he belonged to the right class and caste and had the right connections with the Danish royal family. So he became the captain of the enterprise. There were the trade ships Christian and Copenhagen, as well as the warship David, accompanying them, as well as a Dutch escort ship to guide them on the way around the African Cape of Good Hope and to India. Okay, after a number of adventures, which are quite a lot and which I don't have the scope to talk of here, the ships reached Ceylon in 1620. When the Orison, which had started as a scout ship, had reached Ceylon, Crappe had been away from the Bay of Bengal for some time. He discovered that his friend, he was the King of Kandy, was rapidly losing power to the expansionary Portuguese. Now, with his little band of sailor soldiers and a few guns that he had, Crappe agreed to a desperate deal with the King of Kandy that if he would attempt to drive out the Portuguese, the king would give the Danes generous trading terms. Except that he probably didn't wait for the major Danish fleet to arrive. So the Portuguese got the better of him. He lost his ship and he was seized and taken to Nagapattinam. However, his friend Raghunath Nayak from Tanjore found out and forced the Portuguese to hand him over there. Okay. One thing was, so Crappe had told him that there is a Danish fleet on the way, and Nayak, just like the King of Kandy, saw this as an opportunity to get the Portuguese out of his skin. Okay. So a message managed to get sent to Gede, and instead of heading for Ceylon, he went to Tanjore. And there the Danes managed to secure a treaty with the Nayaks of Tanjore. And that being that a fortress and a factory would be established at Tarangambadi, which is known usually by its Portuguese spelling as Tranquebar. I am somewhat inconsistent. Sometimes I use the Danish, sometimes I use the Portuguese spelling throughout my presentation. Okay, the treaty having been signed, Goethe left for Denmark. Okay, never to return. Nevertheless, the founding of the Danish colony at Tranquebar is almost always credited to him, with no credit given to Roland Krappe. Okay, talk of the caste system. So this is a view of Tarangambadi with the Maslamaninathar temple here. Okay, for all my fascination with Tarangambadi, and trust me, I now know almost every square inch of the place. I have never actually set foot in there. It has remained a dream that has been interrupted by various factors here and there. Okay, now the most common etymology is that the word comes from Tarangam, which is Sanskrit song, and Badi, which is from Tamil Padi or coastal village. And the idea being that this is the village of the singing waves. Okay, its official establishment goes back to the time of Kulasekara Pandyan, Maravarma. Okay, in the name of Kulasekara Patnam. Now, this is not very clear because there are a number of villages that claim the title of Kulasekara Patnam, all the way up to Kayal near Tuticorin. Okay, so it is home to the Maslamaninathar temple, and according to an inscription on the wall of the temple, the town has hosted sailors and traders from 18 countries. So Tarangambadi has been an international destination throughout its history. Okay, here is the actual treaty that Roland Krappe had negotiated with Raghunatha Nayak. Okay, the treaty was negotiated by Krappe but signed by Goethe. Okay, the full thing exists in the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen. Okay, it's dated to the Raudra year Chitrai month 20th day, which after some conversions and all comes to about the 25th of April 1620. Okay, alongside is, so while this is a gold leaf, more like a it's similar to a copper plate grant, except that it's on gold leaf. Alongside is more European style treaty that was negotiated in Portuguese, which is then the lingua franca along the whole Coromandel region. And according to the terms, for their rent of the town of Tarangambadi, they were to pay 2,000 chakrams annually on Vijayadashami day to the Nayaks. Okay. This is the original copy of the treaty between the Danes and the Nayaks in Portuguese, also in the National Archives of Denmark. Okay, these two are regarded as some of the national treasures of Denmark, even today. Okay, so let's talk about this rather remarkable Roland Krappe, one of the first visitors I'm going to talk of today. Okay, he came from very poor Dutch origins. He joined the VOC. He had traveled around with them in the Bay of Bengal, in the so-called East Indies and various things. Then he left the company, gone back to Europe, and had been tapped to then sort of help the Danish East India Company do things. So he came back out of retirement, came back into the Bay of Bengal, was appointed the first full-time governor of Tranquebar. Okay. Then, unfortunately for him, his luck wasn't terrible. Many of his ships often sank, so that by the first 7 years of the company's operation, only 3 trading ships that traded regularly between Tranquebar and Copenhagen were left. Okay. What also he could not control was that a very large number of Danes and Dutch people were also shamelessly carrying out their private trade, violating the official monopoly of the DOK. And unlike the Dutch and the English, he was not really able to enforce it hard. But nevertheless, he managed to set up a factory at Machilipatnam in 1625 and further extended into the Mughal territories with offices at Pipli and Balasore, both in Odisha. However, he's trying on one hand and luck is kicking him on the other. By 1625, with not too many shifts left, they ceased trading on their own. Instead, what they started doing was they started renting out their ships to the Dutch, the Mughals, the Portuguese, and the English as a sort of neutral third party, especially trade between the East Indies and Tranquebar. So the idea was that anything carried on a Danish ship would be neutral. So the Dutch, Portuguese, English, Mughals who were at various times at war with each other would not fire on these ships. Okay. Eventually, 1636, Krappe was summoned back to Denmark and replaced as governor by Barent Pechart. Okay, so this is the trading route established by Krappe. The main export from both Tranquebar and Masulipatam was Indian textiles. And the main import were rice. Siamese rice is highly priced by Indian elites, and elephants from Siam for the purpose of the war purposes of the Nayak of Tranquebar. So that was a very important condition for them to get their factory at Tranquebar. Okay. With the Indies, the trade that was made was South Indian textiles, which are highly valued all of these places. And in return, which was not so much in demand in India as much as in Copenhagen, were pepper, clove, nutmeg, mace, and sugar, which he got from factories that he'd set up at Bantam and Makassar. And then, so there would be a triangular trade. You would have certain European goods, luxury goods coming into Tranquebar. Textiles would then go from Tranquebar to Southeast Asia. Spice would then go from Southeast Asia, land at Tranquebar. They would pick up textiles and then make the grand big journey right across the Arabian Sea around the Cape of Good Hope to Europe and then back. Okay, so now we come to Barent Pechart. Okay, one of the most colorful men that has probably set foot on Tamil soil. Okay, his contemporaries described him as an intelligent but most unreliable man. Okay, in 1638, he was taken hostage by the Golconda Sultanate. Okay, so that's not very long after he turned up. This is because he sort of shifted the de facto headquarters of the Danes from Tarangambadi to Masulipatam in order to take advantage of the larger territory of the Golconda Sultanate and the higher opportunities that they had. But he made many, many high-risk deals. Okay, he overpromised and underdelivered and, plunged the company severely into debt. And the debt has been quantified by Danish historians to the extent of 35,800 pagodas. And when this debt was not payable, the Sultanate simply took him hostage. And now the Danish had no money essentially to pay that debt. Okay, but then they decided to go back to their ancient Viking roots. And the Danish sailors in 1640, after having tried for 2 years unsuccessfully to get their governor released, one day privateered a ship belonging to Mir Muhammad Sayyid Ardastani, so who was a very prominent merchant of Golconda. And his ship was worth a lot. So that they used essentially as leverage, and Ardastani went and pleaded with the Sultan that do not endanger my trade, just let this bastard go. And so it was agreed that the Sultanate ship would be released and in exchange for Pechart. Okay. Unfortunately, Pechart's dirty ways continued until 1643, when he was replaced as governor by William Lyell. Okay, but when Lael arrived, Fort Dansborg, which is the main fortified compound in Tarangambadi, Peshad refused to let him in. Okay, Peshad had already become deeply unpopular among the locals, among all the local Indian kings, with the king in Denmark and everyone. So Peshad essentially knew that if he was to honorably go back to Copenhagen, he'll land in jail. Okay, so Peshad shut himself up in Dansborg, and Lael had to resort to laying siege to his own citadel. Okay, so native community leaders gave him assistance, this, that. Eventually, Peshad made a deal with the Portuguese, and in a night operation befitting a Bollywood movie, managed to transfer the fort's best guns, its entire treasury, and all its account books onto a Portuguese ship and fled, and is never heard of again. Okay. Lael has his own story, which I would recommend you, if you're really keen, you should buy this book and read it. I haven't. But Lael managed to get back to Fort Dansborg, but the credit of the Danes had completely been destroyed. He had no money, he had no books, he really didn't know how to govern the colony, who was owed whom, because people then came with claims of unpaid salaries, the Tanjore Raja had to be paid his dues, etc., etc. And Lael had no clue because he had no books. Also, he had, in any case, no money to pay anything. So the Nayak of Tanjore was very angry. But the Nayak of Tanjore was rather unpopular among his people. And therefore, when he actually laid siege to Tarangambadi, the general public of Tarangambadi rose up against him, and Nayak had to withdraw. Now, having read the success of the Danes in rescuing the former governor, Lael decided that the only real resort he had was to start privateering again. So, with his men and guns, what guns he had, okay, luckily for him, the European guns of that time were nevertheless superior to Indian guns, which remains a sore point throughout late medieval India, but which is story for another day. So privateering became the Danes' chief source of revenue. And throughout the terms of Lael and subsequent governors, Tranquebar was essentially a pirate colony. Unfortunately, this act of privateering or piracy, so if the government does it, it's called privateering. If private citizens do it, it's called piracy. That's the difference. This led to difficulties for all other Europeans, because to the Mughals, you were all white Christians, right? So they couldn't differentiate between Dane and Dutch, English and Portuguese. Okay, you are all Gora, you are all like cut from the same cloth. Okay, I can give you all number of Mughal swear words, but this is an honorable platform. But that's how horrible he had made the situation for everyone. Okay, eventually in 1639, the EIC was effectively folded. Okay, it had been plagued by shipwrecks. Its intended source of revenue, which was trade, it had only managed to transport 7 cargoes to Denmark, mainly Malian pepper and Makassar cloves, and had not been as profitable as had been expected. And after 1639, Tranquebar was completely cut off from Denmark. Okay, by 1655, Eskil Andersen Kongsbakker, the fourth character I'm going to talk of, was the only Dane surviving east of Africa. So the Danes had also tried to set up some colonies in the West Indies and in Africa, but those are different stories. Tranquebar was their one and only effort, along with other little efforts they made time to time in Bengal. But from 1655 to 1670, Tranquebar was all on its own. It was, for all purposes, an autonomous Tamil city, okay, paying tribute to whichever Nayak of Tanjavur, but with a single Dane in charge, that was Eskil Anderson Kongsbacka. He was fairly low born. He was a commoner and had no means of connecting with Copenhagen except through any Dutch ship which would pass. But he nevertheless proved to be a very competent leader. He had married a Tamil lady, okay, organized a very effective defense of Tranquebar. So this is the map of Tranquebar in his time. This is the little fortress called Fort Dansborg. This is the town of Tranquebar. Outside it is the larger territory of Tranquebar. There are about 15 villages that were controlled by the town. And these outer fortifications were built by Kongsbacka. Okay, each of these has a name, and Intact Pondicherry has actually very, very carefully documented all of this. All of that. So, lacking in tribute, the Vijayanagar Nayak again sent an army to besiege. So this has happened multiple times. But just like the previous governors, the people here were very happy to, live on their own rules without a king ruling over them, and formed a very effective defense, which again caused the Tanjore forces to withdraw. Okay, so in this period, under the leadership of Kongsbacka, who had no official position, because he had no connection with Copenhagen, no letter appointing him as governor or anything, but it had now become a pirate state. Okay, so, the remaining Danish ships with Danish guns, but operated entirely by Tamil sailors and gunners, would rove the Bay of Bengal, and now this is pure piracy because there is no Danish state involved. And Kongsbacka actually managed to build up the revenues of Tranquebar again. By the time he ceased to be governor, he had rebuilt the treasury with 19,000 pagodas. Okay? But repeated sieges by Tanjore made it very clear to him that one of the other days you are going to lose. And so he decided that the only option surviving was to send an emissary to Copenhagen through the Dutch and ask for help. So the Danish government realized that the colony at Tranquebar was still around, and so sent the frigate Pharaoh to India. Okay. Now on the frigate was also a letter from the King of Denmark formally appointing Kongsbacka as the governor of Tranquebar, and Eggers was to be his deputy. However, Eggers being high caste, with the Danish soldiers who also looked down upon Kongsbacka for having gone native and all of that stuff, very quickly the new Danish force managed to sideline Kongsbacka completely. So he died in 1674. Unfortunately, his grave is an unknown grave in Tranquebar. One of the most heroic figures in that place, the one whom I admire the most. And that was the end of the first Danish East India Company. However, the winds had changed by then. Okay. By 1674, a lot had happened. Tanjavur, the Nayaks had gone and been replaced by the Marathas. The same year, the French had taken Puducherry. A little earlier, Nagapattinam had fallen from the Portuguese to the Dutch, and the Portuguese presence in the Bay of Bengal had also essentially finished, after the Dutch also threw them out of Ceylon. Okay. Long earlier, the Nayak of Jinji had been thrown out by Bijapur. And in 1639, that very fateful year, the British had gained a factory and port in Madras. Very soon, of course, they would come to eclipse anyone and everyone in the Coromandel. Sorry, too much of a jump. Okay. So in 1670, a new Danish EIC had been formed when Eggers turned up at Tranquebar. Now, in this period, the British and Dutch had fought multiple wars for the control of the Asiatic trade, that is, trade with India and Southeast Asia. Okay, and all of these wars had ended in stalemate, and the French had partially been marginalized, but still not out of the picture entirely. So, among all of these guys, the only neutral people were the Danes, and that left them a massive advantage. So, what they had been doing on a sort of smaller scale earlier now became the major source of revenue for them, which was to rent out the Danish flag to Dutch, French, and English ships. The Portuguese had ceased to matter altogether. Okay, so Dutch goods, Dutch ships, English or French ships sailing out of India would fly the Danish flag, and that as it approached Europe, okay, would pass through the channel separating England and France, past the Dutch coast and towards Copenhagen. So even though the Dutch, English, and French navies knew very well that these were goods by either their own parties or other people's parties, because they flew the Danish flag, they could not seize the ships or fire on them, okay, for the risk of provoking a war. So the ships would dock in Copenhagen, the goods would be auctioned, and usually it would be Dutch merchants who would buy the lot and then resell them in the markets of Europe. Okay, so to the chagrin of the English, especially, they found that the Dutch were basically cornering the market by turning the Danes into their own version of Shikhandi. Okay, so these were the trade routes of the second day, okay, making Copenhagen emerge as essentially the trading hub of Europe, a role that London had absolutely itched to play. And in this period, they also made the effort of establishing a second colony in Bengal, not far from, today it is a Calcutta suburb, and its original name was Danmarks Nagor. Okay, it still carries that name today. The suburb is called Dinamar Danga. And they were also the only ones allowed to trade with the Philippines, which was then a Spanish colony. This is the only Spanish colony, outside South America. But the Danes, and to some extent the French, had some rights to trade where the English and Dutch did not. So this is that famous triangular trade, which I've already explained. From Copenhagen to Tranquebar, they brought in a lot of luxury European goods, mostly for European expats who were there all over this region, alongside ammunition and armaments for Indian rulers. So the Sultan of Golconda and later the Mughals, who would take over that area, the Nayaks, the Marathas, all of them were buying European ammunition and guns, and this was a profitable trade for the Danes to do so. Okay, so they would sell this in Tranquebar, and then they would buy cloth from Tamil weavers and slaves. It was a major center of the slave trade. There were a lot of lower caste Indians being shipped off to the East Indies as slaves to go and work in the plantations there. Okay, that would go to the East Indies. In the East Indies, they would load up pepper and sugar as well as redwood and bamboo, and then the ship would then make the direct voyage to Copenhagen without coming back to Tranquebar, and then the whole thing continued. Okay. However, in this period, the Dutch were slowly conquering all of the East Indies. One by one, the sultans of Indonesia were becoming first tributaries and then completely conquered by the Dutch. And as they managed to establish political monopoly, they also managed to turn that into a trade monopoly. By 1729, the Dutch had completely shut them out of this trade. It became unprofitable and the DOK was dissolved. So, second time unlucky. Okay. And this is how Tranquebar used to look like in that period. Okay. This is the Fort Dansborg. Now, the governors decided that, the house here was too small to stay in, and therefore they built for themselves. Different governors have built different houses. Many of them are standing still. This is one governor's house. This is another governor's house. There are a few more. Many of them are still standing. Then this was one main street called the Kongsgade or the Kingsway. And there was another main street called the Queensway. Okay. And here is Kongsbakke's outer wall, which was refortified in that period. Then comes the third avatar of this, the Danish Asiatic Company. Okay. Which was founded in 1732 with monopoly years for 40 years. Okay. It would prove to be the most profitable Danish venture ever. In fact, in that period, 1772 to 1807, people have seen that the revenues of the East of the Asiatic Company corresponded with the revenue of the Danish government. So if it rose, the Danish government revenue rose. If it fell, the government revenue fell. So it became the sort of chief source of income for the government. Okay, it traded with all of the way. It also started focusing on the East Asia trade with Canton and other places for tea and porcelain. Okay, but again, the main source of revenue for the company, as opposed to running its own trade, was to rent out the flag, just as the previous company had done. Okay, everyone in Europe was now fighting, especially with the rise of one Mr. Napoleon. Right? The British were fighting the Dutch were fighting the French were fighting the British. All of them were fighting the Swedes, all of them were fighting the Germans. There was this war and that war. Okay. And all sorts of things happening, and therefore everyone wanted a neutral flag, and the eminent power that had been there in the Indian Ocean had now completely faded out and restricted to two very, very tiny enclaves in Goa and Macau, and that was, of course, the Portuguese. Instead were all of these powers fighting among themselves, and the French had also essentially been marginalized after the fall of Napoleon and Tipu Sultan. And therefore, it was essentially now the English and the Dutch who were fighting it out. And eventually, the English would be thrown out of Southeast Asia and the Dutch would be thrown out of South Asia. And the Danes would come to profit under both. Okay. So, they also had long stopped privateering because they discovered that that was getting everybody a bad name. So the best part was to just rent out the flag. So every ship would turn up in Copenhagen and be repurchased by Dutch merchants. Okay, this continued for a long time until one day the British, in their absolute ire, bombed the smithereens out of Copenhagen harbor, destroyed it as a trading port, and finally destroyed the ability of the Danes to be a trading power altogether. But that's for later. Under the Asiatic, they had tried to expand multiple times. So they traded with Colachel, with Calicut. Okay, they established a new colony near Calcutta called Fredericksnagar, now known as Srirampur or Serampur. Okay, in Odisha as Balasore and others. Okay. By 1772, unfortunately, the company had been severely in debt and mostly borrowing from British officials. So its monopoly was terminated, and at some point of time, it got nationalized, and Tranquebar became a royal colony. And it became such an important colony that a symbol of Tranquebar was actually added to the Danish coat of arms. And that is this beautiful little white elephant, okay, with this little black mahout that you can see here, and a little tower-like howdah here. And that got added to the Danish coat of arms, which is still there on the Danish coat of arms. And this is the medal of the Danish Order of the Elephant, which is the highest civilian recognition that you can get in Denmark. Okay? So all of this is like a memory of Tranquebar. And that is when, as I said, the revenues of the Danish trade essentially reflected the revenues of the Danish crown. Now, one of the main things the Danes were doing was, because they were renting out their flag, both at Serampore and at Tranquebar, a lot of corrupt East India Company, British East India Company guys, were carrying on their own trade in violation of the EIC's monopoly. And they would load their ships either at Serampore or at Tranquebar and fly out under the name of the Danes and come to Copenhagen and sell their goods. And the EIC saw this, and because these were Danish ships, could not attack them. If it could catch hold of an Englishman and prove their crimes, it could roast the daylights out of them. But very often it couldn't. So much of this trade was basically black money. And unfortunately, this black money also became the main source of revenue for the Asiatic. And occasionally they had to keep borrowing from the English. And then the interest rate was too much and all of that. And that essentially led to their collapse. Okay. So this is a map of Tranquebar from this period. Now you see the whole, this is the entire territory of Tranquebar. Okay, multiple villages and agricultural lands. And this is the town of Tranquebar with Kongsberg as outer fortification. And this little star here, you see, is actually Fort Tansfield. Okay. Another map, somewhat more in detail, showing the villages, the agricultural fields, and this is slightly more to proportion. This is the town with the Kingsway and the Queensway, and this is the Fort Tansfield. Okay, another detailed plan. Okay, showing the fort and the port that was here. This is the European quarter, and this is the native quarter. So the Europeans and natives lived largely apart because the natives had a lot of issue with the Europeans' morals and this and that, and did not want to mix with the Europeans. Okay, some more artwork. This is on dried palm leaf showing the fort and some Danish ships. And this is on a beautiful ostrich egg. Okay, so this was the rather colorful picture of the Danes. Now we come to sort of a 180-degree revolution, and we look at the shadow that lasted. Okay, and that is this gentleman known as Bartholomew Ziegenbalg. Okay, so he was actually a German, but the Lutheran king of Denmark. So this is an interesting story, okay? At this point, Denmark alternates between kings named Christian and kings named Frederick. The kings named Christian are more interested in trade, and they are the ones who set up the East India and the Asiatic companies. The kings named Frederick are more interested in religion. They're usually the ones shutting down the companies and appointing missionaries. Okay. So in 1705, King Frederick IV of Denmark wanted to send a Lutheran mission to convert the heathens and save their souls. Okay. So he chose this fellow Ziegenbalg, on the recommendations of senior Lutheran ministers, along with a co-traveler, and they were sent to India. On the ship, on his way to India, he and his companion, they both learned Portuguese. Now, the original idea was that he was to learn Portuguese and try and deal with the half Portuguese, half Indian, half caste people who, the so-called post-colored, who were ripe for conversion. And his friend was to learn Tamil and deal with the Tamilians. But it turned out that Ziegenbalg had a better appetite for languages, and so the roles reversed. Okay. So he mastered Tamil very quickly, landed in Tranquebar, and in the tenure that he had there, so from 1705 to 1719, he died at a rather young age of 35, being a rather sickly person by constitution. But in the time that he was there, he had managed to publish a Tamil grammar, the first modern grammar of the language. He had compiled a Tamil English, no, not an English, sorry, Tamil Portuguese German dictionary, and translated a few Tamil works into German, and created the first New Testament translation. He was also translating the Old Testament before, but he died. So let's look at this person. Okay. So this is a painting of Ziegenbalg in the New Jerusalem Church. Okay. Done in that proud amateurish Indian tradition of using loud colors and absolutely no respect for proportions. Okay. So Ziegenbalg and his companion Plutschau, that's the name, Heinrich Plutschau, commenced their journey to India in November 1705 as Royal Danish missionaries. Okay. But when they turned up in Tranquebar on July 9, 1706, okay, the governor was not at all pleased. Okay. The governor had received a secret letter from the same ship on which Ziegenbalg came to pay no attention to this fellow and absolutely not offer him any kinds of facilities. Okay. The company was afraid that encouraging missionary activity would irritate the South Indians, okay, and interfere with the trade, which as I've already shown you, was quite precarious, and there were already many debts and this and that. Okay, so even though they had a royal charter, the company governor, who was answerable to his board of directors and not to the king, refused them basic necessities like giving them a quarters or any kind of financial support or whatever. But these two nevertheless managed to get on with the job. Okay, so now Ziegenbalg managed to get a house somehow and focused on learning Tamil. Okay, so the routine is that every morning from 6 to 7, he would join his Pandit, one local scholar called Aragappa. Okay, so 6 to 7, he would explain Luther's catechism in whatever Tamil he was managing to learn. So this is like learning by speaking. Okay, then for an hour, he would review whatever new words and phrases that Aragappan had introduced to him. Then from 8 o'clock to noon, and then from 3 to 5, he would read new Tamil books. Okay, then in the evenings, from 7 to 8, he would have a Tamil writer read to him. Okay, so, reading, writing, speaking, listening, he had fixed a language learning module, which is very rigorous and which is now considered like the gold standard of learning any new language. Right? So all of you who've struggled with a TOEFL test will know that these are the 4 aspects you're supposed to master. Okay. Now, the DAIC was just not happy with him being there, and he, on the other hand, was trying to, talk to the locals, take up their issues, essentially inveigle and gain their trust. So, at one point, he intervened on behalf of a Tamil barber's widow because she had some debt dispute with a company employee. He had borrowed money from her husband, not repaid it. She kept pestering for justice. The company was ignoring her case, and then Ziegenbalg interviewed. Okay, and the governor, J.S. Hassius, was absolutely furious that you were stirring up rebellions by first you're converting natives, especially low caste natives. That is causing the high caste Dubashis to get angry with him. And then you're taking sides against company employees. Is that so? He slammed him in jail. The man was in jail for about 5 months. Okay, but he used to send regular reports from Tranquebar to Copenhagen, which would then go on to the German city of Halle, where then they would get published in Lutheran newsletters and all and spread all over Europe. And a lot of Europeans had been enthusiastically reading all these reports of his mission work, the conversions, the this, that, and all. So that means he had gained some initial popularity in Europe. So when word came that he had been slammed in jail, very angry letters were sent to the DEIC headquarters from the Lutheran missions, and the DEIC had to finally let go of him. Okay, so that made him very popular suddenly, and he had a fresh energy. But persistent conflicts meant that once he had to make one journey back to Europe in 1714 and come back to sort of get more support from the Lutheran church, which is supporting him, and from the Danish court. But we come back to him and his achievements. For his missionary work, he decided that he needed to have mass-printed materials. Now, Ziegenbalg's approach to missionary work is very different from that of those who came before him, and he basically left behind the template for future missionaries. So before him, you had missionaries like Francis Xavier. But Francis Xavier was more interested in modern day gaming language, you might call it the kill count. Okay? That is to baptize very, very large number of people, whether they understand the Christian doctrine or not. And very often Francis Xavier had the support of the Portuguese military. So the basic message was convert or the people behind me will shoot you. So he managed to gain a lot of converts, but they very soon realized that they knew next to nothing about Christian doctrine, and though they were Christian in name only, they were continuing to practice whatever were called their heathen practices. So Ziegenbalg knew this because he also traveled extensively in Tamil Nadu during his stay in Tranquebar, and he realized this is not the way forward. So he decided that even if he was going to make few converts, he was going to make them deep converts. For that, he needed material to be mass produced. So he made appeals to get hold of a printing press. Now, prior to Ziegenbalg, the Portuguese had a printing press in Goa, and they had printed a few Catholic works in Tamil. So this is one of those Portuguese works. But they were very inconsistent, and so even though they get the credit of the first, they were not very systematic about it. Okay. So in 1712, British Protestants, very impressed with his work, sent him a press. But it had only English and Latin type. Now that didn't impress him. He wanted a Tamil printing press. And so the second press turned up from Germany in 1713. Now this is the museum at Tarangambadi set up in modern times in Ziegenbalg's actual house. But whether this is the actual printing press that he was using or not, I cannot say. But he managed to get a guy called Gottlieb Alder to actually create handcrafted Tamil type for Ziegenbalg. Okay. So Ziegenbalg had sent him a letter showing him all the Tamil letters, all their vowel forms. Tamil printing is not a job for beginners, right? But Gottlieb Alder then managed to do this. He set up a letter foundry. All these copper types were cast, and Alder actually accompanied the press to India, set it up, and went back. Okay. So that was the start of the first Tamil printing press on Tamil soil. And we'll come back to what he did. On the side, he was setting up schools. Okay. He set up 3 schools. Now, being mindful of the caste system there, he set up 3 schools. So one school was a Portuguese school, which under his companion Prutshav was to cater to individuals of mixed Indian and Portuguese descent. Okay. Then there was a Danish school set up for children of pure European descent who would study in Danish medium. And then Ziegenbalg himself set up a Tamil medium school. And then he did something which was considered radical both from Tamil and the Danish perspective. He enrolled both boys and girls in his school. He also enrolled children from all castes and made them sit in the same classroom and learn the same things. And as far as I know, and I'm happy to be proved wrong, Ziegenbalg School is India's first recorded school for girls. Okay, around 1713, a letter that he sends reports 47 students in the Tamil school, 20 in the Portuguese school, and 15 in the Danish schools. And remember, he also says that the Tamil and Portuguese students had free tuitions and meals. So anybody giving credit to the midday meal scheme to MGR, please note, Ziegenbalg had beaten him by 2.5 centuries. Now, this was a very central tenet of his missionary strategy. His idea was that A, he was going to, be caste blind, and B, he wanted them to learn Christianity properly and be deeply educated Christians, not just nominal Christians like what Francis Xavier was doing. Okay. The other thing was to train indigenous pastors. Now, the more Ziegenbalg lived and traveled around Tamil Nadu, the more sensitive and appreciative he became of Tamil culture. And he decided that the Portuguese strategy or other strategies followed by Protestants elsewhere, okay, was to create westernized Christians. So they were not only to be Christianized, but also Europeanized, which he said is nonsense. Okay. So Ziegenbalg was a deeply, devout Christian coming from the Pietist movement of the Lutherans. So for him, obviously his faith was the true faith, and he saw the others as lacking in the true faith. But he said that they need to be introduced to the true faith, but if you cannot denigrate their customs and their practices because those have evolved and suited to their needs. So his thing was also that ultimately if Christianity is spread in Tamil Nadu, it must be spread by Tamil pastors. So he made clear that he was going to set up a seminary that would train pastors in Tamil. And the first Tamil indigenous pastor who was ordained, okay, was the first Lutheran pastor, Aaron, who was born Arumugam, okay. He had joined the Tranquebar Tamil school in 1718, but Ziegenbalg died the next year, and he was eventually ordained in 1733 and laid the groundwork for the Tamil Evangelical Lutheran Church, which is still active today. Okay, and this is the church that he built and where he is buried in. So this is called the New Jerusalem Lutheran Church. So in 1707, Ziegenbalg had established a Jerusalem church. Okay, Tranquebar already had one church called the Zion Church, where everybody was supposed to go and pray because Christianity officially does not recognize any division or castes or whatever. But the Tamil converts refused to go and pray alongside the Europeans. They said those people are loose and immorals. Okay. They wear skirts above the ankles. Men and women sit together. Okay. They had all sorts of problems with the whites. So they said, we will not go and those are loose people. They will corrupt our children. Okay. So we may have converted to the true faith, but those customs are not the true customs. Our customs are the true customs, which eventually Ziegenbalg accepted to there. New church had to be built, which is called the Old Jerusalem Church. The Old Jerusalem Church got so popular under his ministry, and also because no Europeans were allowed there, that it soon became overcrowded. And eventually the New Jerusalem Church had to be built. So a much larger church was built. Okay. Now, when it was being built, the ladies went and made a very specific request to him that they should be given a separate entry and exit. Okay. And that they should be able to sit separately from the men. Otherwise, the men will touch them, pinch their bottoms, do dirty men things that, the sort of eve teasing that is unfortunately still a feature of Indian public life. So, as per their wish, the church was built in an L shape or in a cross shape. Okay. Women entered and exited from one side, men entered and exited from there, and inside the church they were not allowed to mingle. Okay, so this is the New Jerusalem Church. It is very well maintained because it is still the main church of Tarangambadi. I couldn't find any record of the Old Jerusalem Church, but as I said, I've never been there. Maybe when I go there, I can do some detective work. But this is the L-shaped church. Okay, the women's wing and the men's wing. This is a plan of Tranquebar from that period. Okay, and the things I marked in red are the religious buildings here. The Ziegenbalg Spiritual Center, which is a converted building to some governor's house. The New Jerusalem Church, which is here, is beautiful cross-shaped church. Okay. Then 19 is the Ziegenbalg Museum, which is set up in his own house. 21 is the printing press, which is the original place where he was printing his books. And 22 is the Portuguese school that Lucia used to run. This is work done by Intact. Okay. So this is Corsor's house, which is now the Ziegenbalg Spiritual Center. Okay. So he did come into severe conflict with the upper caste Hindus as well as the secular company authorities. Okay. As I said, the main problem was the upper caste Hindus and Muslims, especially the Dubashis. They saw the Christians as, the Christian religion as not being moral enough in the way that they understood. Okay. Like free mixing of men and women and whatever things. So many of them often misunderstood European customs as Christian customs. Okay, also the idea that Ziegenbalg focused on converting the lower castes really irritated the Dubashis. Okay. Over time, Ziegenbalg also ran into opposition from his pietist sponsors in Denmark and Germany, and eventually they would also stop sending him money. Okay. So their idea of a missionary was to go back to the apostles and live in apostolic poverty. Like the apostles were poor and they were getting beaten and martyred, and they expected modern missionaries to be exactly like that. With Ziegenbalg didn't really agree with me. How is that effective in any way? My becoming a saint does not do anything for my Christian cause. So, his idea of offering meals and stipends and Christian publishing and all that, the pietists felt that was very bad. And, there were two schools again. There were the fundamentalists and the more modernists, and eventually the fundamentalists took over and cancelled all his money. And one of those was this fellow called Christian Wendt, who's not the one pictured. And they often used to send mean and nasty letters which dispirited him, and he said to have essentially broken his spirit, leading to his early death. Okay. But what he is remembered today, what I call the long shadow, is for the Tamil studies that he, progressed in. By 237, he had actually collected a large number of local Tamil and Portuguese books, including a very large number of Tamil palm leaf manuscripts, most of which are now in Denmark and Germany. Okay, as his Tamil learning progressed, his perspective had also undergone a very, very profound change, especially when he had taken to living among the slaves in the Tamil quarter, which also had irritated the Europeans. Okay, so one of his lasting contribution is the Grammatica Daemoniaca. It is titled in Latin, but most of it is actually written in German, and which was a grammar of the Tamil language. And today this is a foundational text for modern approaches to Tamil grammar. Okay. Now remember, grammar must be studied in both prescriptive and descriptive means. Okay. So ilakkanam, as we suffer through school, is usually prescriptive grammar, that you must speak like this, you must write like this is the right way to do this, do that. Whereas a descriptive grammar is usually, written by an outsider, that this is how these people speak, these are the verb endings, these are noun endings, these are the variations from place to place, etc., etc. So the Grammatica Daemoniaca is actually a descriptive grammar, but it has become the foundation for very, very modern studies, and especially the grammatical works of G.U. Pope and others. And modern grammatical works that we suffer in school are all derivatives of the work done by Ziegenbalg. And of course, the rediscovery of the Tolkappiyam, and a whole lot of other ancient Tamil texts has also led to, a resurfacing of Tamil interest in ancient Tamil language. But modern Tamil grammar is still on the lines of what he described. So he is describing Tamil grammar as of the Tamil language spoken in his time, early 1700s, and modern grammars are basically based on this. Anyone who studied Tirukkural lessons in school will immediately know that our modern Tamil grammar is next to nothing like the grammar of Tolkappiyam and others, right? He also set to work on compiling a 40,000 word Tamil German Portuguese dictionary, but by the time he died, it was unfinished and never got published. But his manuscript was then used by Johann Philipp Fabricius, a Lutheran missionary in Chennai, to create a 40,000 word Tamil English dictionary, which is now seen as the first modern dictionary of the Tamil language. Okay. In 1708, he had also commenced translation of the Bible into Tamil. Okay. Under the Protestant principle that God's words must be in the people's language, as opposed to the Catholic idea that the Bible is a sacred document and that Hebrew, Greek, and Latin are the only acceptable languages for the Bible. So while in Europe it was getting translated into German, Danish, English, all of that, Ziegenbalg wanted to translate it into Tamil. So he completed the translation of the New Testament, right, which is the actual Christian part of the Bible, by 1711. Okay, and then was so tremendously proud of this achievement that he called it a treasure in India which surpasses all other Indian treasures. Okay, now I might give him some leeway for his boasting, because, well, some of the works that are really treasures, like the Tolkappiyam, like Silapadigaram, had actually not yet been rediscovered. Okay. The first part of his New Testament translation got printed in Tarangambadi in 1714 and the second part in 1715, becoming some of the earliest printed Tamil books on Tamil soil. Okay. It was also the first translation of the New Testament into any Indian language, and that had a tremendous influence on missionaries who came after it. Okay. Then he started translating the Old Testament, but he had died in 1719, and Fabricius then continued his translation work, building and finished translating the rest of the Old Testament, and then a complete Tamil Bible was subsequently published in 1727 in Chennai. Okay, so this is the first work in Tamil. Now, see, translating and publishing the Bible was not his only mission, right? He wanted it to be mass produced and distributed among the people. For that, he had also persuaded his English sponsors to fund the establishment of a local paper mill and manufacturing printing ink. Okay. And thus he set the stage for a robust Tamil publishing industry. Okay. In fact, as the presses in Tranquebar and later in Chennai were pushing out a lot of Christian literature, triggered a Hindu backlash. They established their own presses and started churning out Hindu works. And so, that genuinely helped boost literacy, general literacy in Tamil Nadu, as lots of cheap works were available to a lot of people. Okay. He had a tremendous influence on William Carey, who was at the mission in Serampore, and Carey also continued translating the Bible into 25 plus Indian languages. Okay. As I said, Ziegenbalg was very keen on creating a Tamil Christianity, and that they should be Christians but Tamils, and I think that is an attitude that has persisted even today. So my final slide. He has tremendous influence in Tamil Nadu, lasting influence today, because he set up a printing press and created Tamil type. The modern Tamil script is basically what was typeset by for Ziegenbalg. The spread of schooling was another thing. The spread of publishing was another thing. Okay, his deliberate ignoring of caste was another thing. So today he's perceived as an early contributor to that reformist thought that 2 centuries later would become what is called the Dravidian. So with that is essentially the long shadow of Ziegenbalg. Now I have exceeded my time, so I will terminate my talk here and be happy to take questions.
Gopu?
Yeah, 1 minute. Yeah, thank you, Raamesh. That was a really insightful talk on a subject about which most people may not know so much. We'll now have R. Gopu from Tamil Heritage Trust to moderate the question answer session.
Thank you, Gopu.
Thank you, Mr. Raamesh Gowri Raghavan, for a very nice lecture, very interestingly illustrated, a lot of beautiful pictures, a lot of texts, a lot of things that we are somewhat familiar with Ziegenbalg here, but this was a very detailed exposition, and also of the early activities of the Danish East India Company, their relationships with the Dutch and all that. One of the things that I think we Indians don't pay attention to is all the inter-European conflicts that affected the fortunes of various cultures. I mean, for example, Portugal was like the dominant power for a while, but Spanish Pope, when the Portuguese king died, the Spanish king became the de facto king of Portugal. And for 60 years, the Portuguese didn't have a king, and so they lost enormous amounts of land and territory. Like that Spanish invasion of Netherlands, which they rebelled against, all those things generally we only focus on Indian history without focusing on the other events in Europe and Americas that affected us. That's fascinating. You talked about early on about privateering, that there are periods when they could not make much of the trade or they didn't have many ships. So some of the Danes took to privateering. That's just a fancy word for piracy, right?
So if it is state-sponsored, it is privateering. If it is private, it is piracy.
Okay. Well, that's
Remember, the English used to do a lot of privateering upon Spanish ships that were
yes,
coming back from South America to Europe.
yeah, that's generally kept out of Indian history syllabus anyway. So we have to read English sources for that. That's fascinating. But were they the only ones doing that, or are the others doing it too? The Dutch or the Portuguese?
Everybody was doing it. The East India Company was doing it shamelessly. I mean, they used to privateer so many Mughal ships, especially in the area of Surat.
Okay.
That there was one time when the Mughals ran out of patience and actually came close to throwing the English out of bomb.
Okay. Another question I have is about the printing press.
Yes.
We know about Ziegenbalg introduced the printing press, but most of the government, most of the people in the governments in the native kingdoms did not adopt either paper or the printing press. That really, if you look at Indian history, it seems like until the end of around 1800, 1810, that's when they started adopting the press as a means of, because there was some prestige associated with palm leaves and things like that. Can you comment on that?
So it's not so much prestige as much as the fear of literacy. As long as education and the ability to read and write is locked up with a tiny elite, there was a lot of control that they had. So the Brahmins, the Dubashes, and the ruling class preferred to keep that. And so the handwriting component and all was that. It's only when the Christians broke that monopoly, and especially Ziegenbalg, with freely distributing cheap work, that mindset finally broke.
Okay. So I'll take some questions from the audience and others, the THT owns participants. Badri actually has a question. Beshki or Beshki, Joseph Beshki, called Veerama Munivar, was in Tamil Nadu at the same time. But he was a Catholic. And he was contemptuous of Ziegenbalg and called him
Yes.
Luthery or something like that. Was there any interactions between them?
So they were, yes.
Sorry, Badri here. So there is a cuss word in Tamil where we say tutheri, and I believe Beshi used to call Ziegenbalg there at the same time Lutheri, which is Lutheran and a cuss word combined together, right? So it'd be very interesting to find out whether they talked about each other. They certainly did not like each other. That much I can certainly say. Yeah.
So, see, the Catholics and Lutherans were rivals for the souls of the Indians. And their missions were clearly at odd ends, right? Every convert to Lutheranism was a loss to Catholicism and vice versa. Plus, of course, the Catholic Church loathed the entire Lutheran revolution because, its revenue-rich regions in Germany and others had been lost to Protestantism. And then came the Catholic counter-revolution and all of that. So you have to keep that in mind, that these two parts of Christianity, even today, they absolutely loathe each other doctrinally and all of that. They may not be so violent now. But so, letters sent back by Veerama Munivar and letters sent back by Ziegenbalg are very disparaging of each other. But and that's how that the Luthery becomes a cuss word in Tamil. But that said, the Catholics had to adopt to what Ziegenbalg was doing and set up their own printing and churn out more work, because otherwise he was going to eat their lunch.
Okay. I have a question about the trade. You said one of the things, so most of them, they're exporting textiles from here. That's the major product that was going out of the East Coast, especially Tamil Nadu.
Yes.
But we've always heard of pepper as an export. Here you are mentioning pepper, clove, nutmeg. I know clove and nutmeg were imported from the Indonesian islands. But was pepper imported too by the Danes into?
So the Danes had to source pepper from the Indies because the Dutch had basically cornered the pepper trade in the Malabar. So they had arrangements with the people at Cochin and at sorry, what is that place? Travancore for the pepper trade, and the Danes could not get a headway. So they tried to establish a trading place at Colachel, and the Dutch drove them out.
Okay. You also said there were slave trades and they were taking them to plantations. Were there plantations that early in the 17th century itself? I thought the plantations were, especially tea and others, they happened only in the 18th and 19th centuries.
These are spice plantations in the East Indies for which Indian slaves were needed.
Indians were taken to the East Indies
Yes.
for collecting the spices there?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I didn't know that. I mean, I'm hearing of that for the first time. I thought they were taken only in the late 19th century. So 18th and 19th centuries for that kind of.
The indentured labor, the so-called indentured laborers, right? This is a different way of slavery.
Okay.
These were actual slaves.
So we heard about the conflicts with the primarily with on the religious side. What about the business side with the English? Or because the English in Madras, the Dutch in Pulicat. I mean, you talked about the some of them losing some of the trade to the Dutch for a little while, and the French. We were only talking about the Portuguese, but what are other European powers also fighting the Danish here? How do they manage that?
So the Danish were officially neutral. They did not get into any of the European conflicts.
Okay.
Which meant that they could use, see, it was a European code of honor that you do not attack a neutral flag. So the English could attack Dutch ships and vice versa whenever they were at war.
Yeah.
So if you couldn't attack a Danish ship,
okay.
So the Dutch ships would essentially dock in Tranquebar, turn themselves into Danish ships, fly the Danish flag, and head to Europe. And same with the English, same with the others.
So
they were the Tranquebar was the Switzerland of its time, you could say.
Were they confined only to Tranquebar? Were they there in any other? I know you said they tried to attempt something in the Indonesian islands but couldn't succeed. Did they try anything because they are all conflicting in all over the places, right? I mean, Andhra, in Kerala. Did the Dutch try the Danish try anything anywhere else?
Yes. So the Danes tried to have a factory at Machilipatnam. Was not very successful. They tried twice near Calcutta, first at Danmarksnagar and later at Frederiksnagar. Frederiksnagar was quite a success, which is called Serampore. So they had, till the very end, they had two outposts, one at Tranquebar and one at Serampore. And they were both basically meant to sell the flag and allow the Dutch and English people to, trade under the Danish flag.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think we are running a little short on time. We'll move on to the next speaker. And if you could stay on, perhaps you could, if you have any questions, we'll pass them on to you at the end of the second speaker's talk.
Sure, thank you.
We can send the questions to him as well.
Okay.
Easier that way. Wonderful. Great.
Happy to answer them.
That was really a very nice talk, very insightful, and a nice question answer session. Now we'll move on to the second talk for the day. One minute. Yeah, the second talk of the day is Encounters with India à la Francaise, Francois Bernier and Jean-Baptiste Tavernier by Dr. Faith E. Beasley. Now moving on to the talk. France's encounter and relationship with India is remarkably at odds with the traditional history as constructed by India's colonialist conquerors, chiefly the British. 17th century French society was fascinated by India. Allusions to India in French texts point to an enriching encounter between these two worlds at a time when each produced the wonders so admired today, Versailles and the Taj Mahal. Francois Bernier came to India as a physician to Prince Dara Shikoh and later to Emperor Aurangzeb from 1656 to 1668. He has meticulously documented his observations of the Mughal Empire, published in his book, Travels in the Mughal Empire. A reading of Bernier's texts in the original context of France's great century and in conversation with other French travelers such as Jean-Baptiste Tavernier underscores the fact that different societies engage with new worlds in their own ways and produce their own distinctive narratives. In her talk, Dr. Faith E. Beasley will uncover the many facets and nuances of the story of France's particular engagement with India that will open the way to a new understanding of the relationship between the East and the West. A little bit about the speaker. A professor of French cultural studies at Dartmouth, USA, Dr. Faith E. Beasley is an author of several books and articles, including Revising Memory, Women's Fiction and Memoirs in 17th Century France, and History and the Creation of 17th Century France. In 2013, she was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship to complete her book, Versailles Meets the Taj Mahal, Francois Bernier, Marguerite de la Sable, whatever, and Enlightening Conversations in the 17th Century France. Subsequently, she has also worked on its updated and augmented French edition, which is a pioneering work. Apart from teaching, research, and writing, she directs foreign study programs in France and India and organizes conferences. She divides her time between Hanover, New Hampshire, USA, Paris, France, and India. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Beasley. We are delighted to have you here today. You may take over the screen and begin your talk.
Thank you. Thank you. It's delightful to be here. I will share my screen. Let's see. We have to share. So.
You can take your time. No rush.
Let's see. I should have done this. There we go.
Yeah.
Now you have to go to that application as we.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay,
Yeah,
so
there it is. Yeah.
there we go. Up there. Okay.
Yes.
Now, how are we?
Click
No,
on
no, no. The right down below the Tamil Heritage Trust, the first presentation. No, you are already there in the application itself. You have to select the presentation.
Yeah. Just click that twice.
Okay. There.
Yeah. That's
Now we should be okay.
Go to the full screen.
And the slideshow.
The first button down below.
No, one left.
To your left. Further
Yes.
left.
There we go.
Yeah. That's it.
There.
Wait.
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
How's that?
Yeah, fine.
Okay.
Fine, you can start from the beginning. Yep, absolutely.
Let's see. We need to go back though.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
So again, thank you for the invitation to talk about one of my very favorite subjects. So as you said, as Gary's mentioned, for the past 30 years, I have lived between three worlds. So between the US, where I'm a professor of French history and literature, France, where I do my research and often direct foreign study programs, and India, where my husband is originally from. And we take our two children as often as we can. Almost 20 years ago, I came across this line by Voltaire, one of Europe's most eminent 18th century philosophers, and which he wrote in 1756. And he wrote that India, and this is the quote, is the only country that the whole world needs, but who needs no one. So when I first read this line, I was very intrigued and perplexed. How could a preeminent philosopher living in 18th century France conceive of India in this way? This wasn't the first reference to India that I had come across that suggested that there was an untold story to tell about the relationship between France and India in the period that I've been studying for decades, the 17th and primarily the 17th and somewhat the 18th centuries, the period before France's revolution, when France exerted unparalleled and unequaled power over the minds of Europeans. In order to understand Voltaire's attitude towards India, and he was far from the only one to have at the time to hold such views, we must return to the 17th century and France's first sustained and documented encounters with India. Voltaire derived his admiration and conception of India from his predecessors. If Voltaire's assessment of India jars with our understanding of the relationship between India and the West during the early modern period, it's because the underlying story that forms the basis for Voltaire's commentaries have been silenced by succeeding generations, buried, overshadowed by, and rewritten through the lens of Orientalism and colonialism, paradigms that today dominate our view of the encounter between East and West. The encounter that inspired Voltaire tells a very different story. A number of Frenchmen in the 17th century, during the century of Louis XIV, France's longest and Europe's longest reigning monarch, traveled to India and then wrote of their adventures. Like other Europeans, they were primarily missionaries and merchants, or simply adventurers. And I've given you just a few. Among the most well-known today being, of course, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier. He is the most well-known because his 6 travels recount, in particular, the diamond trade. He wrote those, though, primarily as guidebooks for other merchants. They weren't really necessarily something to be circulated among the public. Today, we're interested in them primarily because they talk about the French blue diamond. Tavernier supplied, in fact, Louis XIV with diamonds from Golconda, India being the world's only known source of diamonds in the 17th century. We also have accounts by Jean Chardin, another merchant who traded in precious gems and worked for the British and Dutch East India companies, not for the French. We have Melchizedek Thévenot, who was a French intellectual who didn't go anywhere, but he compiled and translated many of these texts, including the texts from England, which he translated into French, and many of the travelers' texts across Europe went through Thévenot, and he published those in French, including those of his own nephew, Jean de Thévenot, who focused primarily on the Ottoman Empire, which at the time was, of course, much better known to the French than India. These travelers wrote to recount their own experiences, and through these experiences, give an idea of what India was like. Most of these texts, though, did not circulate much until the early 18th century and even later. And most of them were focused on Persia, so on the Middle East. They really can't give us the same sense of what the French thought about India in particular, or explain Voltaire's way of thinking about India. So in my first 2 books, in these 2 books, I focused on François Bernier, who, as I will, in fact, today, because arguably up until the 19th century, his texts and his contemporaries' interpretations of his texts and his experiences in India dominated European thought, and not just among intellectuals. When he's interpreted, and this is my argument, when he's interpreted in his original context, and in fact in his original language, and when we recreate how his texts were received and by whom, we get a much fuller sense of how the French, and given France's outsized influence on European thought in the 17th and 18th century, how many Europeans viewed India. We also have to remember that the French language was the dominant language through the 18th century in Europe. And so these texts were actually read primarily in French and also through translation. So my reading of Bernier is different from that of most historians today. I was asking a different question than simply what did the French 17th century public know about India? I wasn't looking for what people said about India, but how accounts were received, what the public thought about India after encountering or after reading. And I say encounter because they didn't just read them, they talked about them, or they read these texts orally. To understand what this encounter was, who this public was, who these people were, and how it influenced French thought, Francois Bernier proved to be the most important source, indeed the only one, who could illuminate how the French viewed India, what they thought about India. France's knowledge and conception of India in the 17th century was dominated by Francois Bernier's texts. This is a history that has been buried in, as I said, in the sands of time and also rewritten, especially by the British in the 19th century. Francois Bernier was the most influential of early modern travelers to India. Today, though, he's conflated with all other travelers. His works are seen often simply as another travel narrative. Many historians read just parts of the 4 volumes on India, and he wrote only on India. He did travel to the Middle East, but he did not write about Persia. And many historians also focus on just one of the letters that he wrote to Colbert, instead of looking at the entire corpus. People also cherry-pick to find descriptions of certain elements, such as sati, that are then used to characterize the India known to early modern Europeans and mark it as different and often as inferior. In addition, the majority of historians today only examine Bernier's texts on India using in 19th century English translations. These translations create a context around Bernier's work that reflects the translator's historical, cultural, and linguistic context. Irving Brock, Bernier's 19th century British translator, who is still used primarily by Anglophone readers. We don't have a modern version yet of Bernier's full text. That's something I'm working on. Irving Brock uses Bernier's text to justify England's colonialist project. In his opinion, Bernier's description of India, and I quote, confirms that the government of the British in India has been a prodigious and incalculable blessing to the Indian people. And he gets that from reading Bernier. Another recent historian interprets Bernier as having, and I quote, nothing but contempt for the religion and philosophy of the Hindus, or for that matter, of the Muslims. And then he goes on to say that Bernier's voyage, which he calls them, are at the origin of the concept of the Oriental despot, saying, and he goes on, Bernier's observations on the Mughal Empire were to become the major source for the 18th century theory of Oriental despotism. This is not the Bernier that I worked on for 10, 15 years, and that I read before even reading these critiques. This particular text I'm showing you here, Voyage de François Bernier, is not the original text. Bernier never called his travel narratives a travel narrative, as we'll see. This was done in Amsterdam at the beginning of the 18th century, and it's the French version. And this is what most people use to then translate, but it's not the original text. Reading Bernier, so outside of his own context, assuming that he was a traveler like any other, who approached India with the same biases, the same sense of the superiority of West over East as later travelers, has overshadowed France's own unique encounter with India. What is particularly striking about France's engagement with India in the mid-17th century is its intellectual nature. And this is in large measure due to the fact that Bernier was first and foremost a philosopher who went to India purely out of curiosity. He was the secretary, first of all, to another philosopher named Gassendi. When Gassendi died, he went down to Montpellier, where he trained to be a physician for 6 months. So he was a physician, but barely. He went to India then finally around 1657, and it was as a physician that he was able to infiltrate the Mughal court, but he wasn't really there as a physician. He witnessed, of course, the civil war that brought Aurangzeb to power. He remained at the court under Aurangzeb through the 1660s, where he was valued primarily for his knowledge, not his medical expertise. He was engaged by Daneshmand Khan, the foreign affairs secretary, and eventually the treasurer of the Mughal Empire, to teach him about European discoveries in astronomy, physics, anatomy, chemistry, logic, etc. In his texts, he describes meeting with Khan almost every night, so that they could just discuss knowledge and philosophy, and he also spoke. He was able to communicate, and he learned the languages, so he was able to learn a lot about Mughal, but also Indian culture in general. So, and because Khan basically was his teacher. So through Khan, Bernier managed to get access to the intellectual, political, and artistic circles of the Mughal court. He then accompanied the court to Kashmir and was the first Westerner to describe Kashmir based on his firsthand experience and write about it. Upon returning from India in 1669, Bernier rejoined his group of intellectuals in Paris and engaged with a wide range of his contemporaries, both male and female. And this is one of the big differences. When he came back, he didn't just join a bunch of other male philosophers. France had a particular culture, what we call the salon culture, where that women developed, where people would come and discuss, people from all various phases or various areas of French society, and discuss books, politics, etc. And it was men and women together, which is very, very different than any place else in Europe at the time. When Bernier returned, he was a poor philosopher and had no place to stay because his benefactor had died. So he went to live with Marguerite de la Sablière. So I'll just call her Marguerite because it's easier. And she became his benefactor. She happened to also have the most intellectual and important salon of the period that was attended by some of the most well-known intellectual, political, religious, worldly, and scientific figures. She was known also as someone who had a telescope on her roof, for example. He lived with Bernier lived with Marguerite de la Sablière purely. There was no love involved. It was she was his benefactor, but she had his whole room, along with La Fontaine. And you might know the fables of La Fontaine. La Fontaine also lived with La Sablière, and they became the major parts of this particular salon that had lots of writers. And so it was not only a very diverse salon, it was very influential, and it was very intrigued with lots of philosophers too. And people wrote. The people who were in that salon wrote a lot. And when Bernier published his texts on India while he was living there, and while he was engaged with this particular public, with these readers, you can call them a worldly public, but they're a mix of intellectuals and religious figures and scientists, etc., but a mix of men and women. And it was the women who decided who got to come to these salons. Bernier was given by his contemporaries the name Le Mogol, the Mughal, in addition to Le Joli Philosophe, the cute philosopher. And there he disseminated the knowledge he had gleaned about India from his personal experiences through his texts, and especially through conversation. So you didn't have to necessarily have read these texts. So I want to give you that's Marguerite de la Sablière. You didn't have to read these texts. You could discuss them. People read passages, etc. So in 1670, so when he just returned home, he published his history. As you can see, this is the original title, History of the Last Revolution of the Grand Mughal. Later that year, he published the next volume, which is the particular events that details Aurangzeb's court, and includes also a letter to Colbert, the Louis XIV's finance minister. Excuse me. A few months later, Bernier provided his contemporaries with 2 more volumes. Now, these 2 more volumes are composed of letters to a few other male philosophers or intellectual figures. The letters are a very interesting genre at the time because they're not private. Letters were read aloud in public. There are lots and lots of versions of these letters. So Bernier is publishing these letters, which he never sent from India, but they're addressed, and they address certain topics that he wants to have his public discuss. We don't even know when he actually first published and first wrote these missives. Many people think that he did it just when he returned. The appearance and the publication of these additional volumes suggests that the first 2 volumes were very well received and captured the imagination and interest of his contemporaries. Bernier's worldly and intellectual public was thrilled, finally, to read an account of one of their own, of someone they could trust, someone who went out of curiosity and not for profit, and was not just someone they considered a lowly merchant or even worse, an Englishman. They weren't particularly fond of Englishmen even then, or some other foreigner. When he was in India, Bernier wrote and received messages and letters back and forth, in particular from someone named Jean Chapelain, who was employed by Louis XIV, but was also an academician, and he was a major salon figure. And Chapelain wrote to Bernier to tell him what it was the French people wanted from him, and said, okay, you're finally there. I'm so happy you are there. It's quite laudable. I'm just going to read parts of this. It's quite laudable that only the passion for knowledge has inspired you to take on the same difficulties and the same sufferings as those among us who go to these distant lands motivated by a desire to save souls and attain heaven. So he's comparing them there to missionaries. And he says, since you're there, and Chapelain writes these letters throughout the whole 10 years that Bernier is there, and he sends them multiple times to make sure that Bernier gets them. So he writes to him saying, since you're there, and because no one else of your nature and of your inclinations or with your motivations will probably ever go there again, take the necessary time to satisfy your curiosity as well as that of your friends on all points. And he gives them a list of what he needs to look at. Always keep in mind that you will perhaps be the only person of your quality who will have been and who will ever go to these unknown countries with the ability to give a faithful and well thought out account. In order to not miss this chance, which perhaps will never occur again, perhaps you should resolve yourself to spending a little bit longer. So he wants to make sure that while someone's there, do this right. He wants them to talk about, Bernier to look at the Indian mechanical arts, farming, buildings, manufacturing, woodwork, silversmiths, etc. And then he also says something, oh, that reminds me of something that almost slipped my mind. Don't forget to examine the way they treat women and see if they are in greater consideration than in Turkey and Persia, if they receive the visits of people, etc. So Chapelain is also representing, in a way, the worldly public that, and the salon public that Bernier will rejoin when he returns to France, in part because Chapelain is indeed part of that group. Salons are not considered to be separate. They're not the private sphere. They're the public sphere, just as the French academies are. So Bernier's decision to publish these particular letters can be viewed as a reflection of the conversations that were provoked by the first 2 volumes that are really histories of the Mughal court. In the letters to his friends, Bernier develops certain characteristics about India in general, not just the Mughal court. And these are the characteristics that he mentions in the first 2 volumes. He tailors his portrait of India to the tastes and interests of his readers and interlocutors, responding implicitly to their request for additional knowledge. These letters, and again, as I said, they're not personal, were read aloud, and thus allow us to perceive how a particular portrait of India was being created in the French context, and how this portrait derived from the interaction between Bernier, his public, and his experiences in India. So Bernier and his texts, which were translated immediately into multiple languages and circulated throughout Europe, allow us to understand the impact the encounter with India was having on the mindset, on the ways of thinking of French and Europeans. Bernier had a greater impact on the history of ideas than any other traveler. People didn't just read his texts, they talked about it due to the existence of French salon culture, which was unique during this period. It's important to stress that people didn't just encounter Bernier alone in a room, reading by themselves. Reading practices in 17th century France were very different. People read in groups, they discussed the text, and these conversations then influenced other texts. And so I was able to reconstruct these conversations by looking for other influences, other mentions of India in text by the people who surrounded Bernier at the time. La Sablière Salon was particularly interesting because it mixed so many different people. Bernier didn't want to just talk about his own experiences and give a portrait of India based on his experiences. He wanted to get people talking about India, to get them also to reflect on their own culture, to talk about differences as well as similarities. And we can trace some of the impact of this engagement with Bernier and his texts in some of the best known writers of the 17th century, which is considered to be France's classical period. So in the time remaining, I want to give a few examples of what these conversations Bernier had with his text and with his public, in order for us to be able to see how the French engagement with India was different. Bernier's text must be interpreted first at a variety of levels, given Louis XIV's control over knowledge. And very often people will say, Bernier contradicts himself. He doesn't really contradict himself. You have to read him at multiple levels because there's a lot of censorship. So he is speaking sometimes to his contemporaries in ways that will not get him in trouble. So one particularly important topic when Bernier was writing for the French as well as Europe in general, but was religion. And we heard about this a little bit in the previous. So the France of Louis XIV had just emerged from the wars of religion at the end of the 16th century, and a treaty had been passed called the Edict of Nantes, Nantes, that guaranteed Protestants the right to practice their religion, which they did, and they were very successful. But by the 1670s, their position was much more tenuous because Louis XIV became more and more conservative, and By 1684, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, and that gave Protestants like Marguerite de la Sablière, who was a Protestant, the choice. Protestants had a choice, and in 1684, they either had to convert or they had to leave France. Marguerite Salon brought together people of all faiths, a range of faiths, not just Catholics. Most were Protestant, many were Protestant. Religion, spiritual practices were subjects of intense interest to Bernier's public in general, but especially the Salon public. One of the distinctive traits of his accounts is his exploration of spirituality and his description of various religious practices in India. He especially underscores the religious hybridity one finds there, the diversity of spiritual practices. Remember, he's a philosopher, so this is what interests him. In the 17th century, the Mughal Empire was known for its religious tolerance and even for its curiosity with respect to other religious traditions. This is a portrait of Jahangir with a picture of the Madonna of the Virgin Mary. He is the only known ruler to ever have himself painted with the iconography of another religion, and that's East or West. On the left, you see a picture of the court celebrating Holi, and it's the Zenana, so the harem. Again, as we'll see, there was a lot of mix, especially at the Mughal court, and it's not something we hear about much today. In the 17th century, as I said, and Bernier underscores this tolerance. This is what interests him. His interest is thus not just in different religious belief systems, but in attitudes towards these differences. He depicts India as a country where the various spiritual practices are accepted. Bernier isn't the only traveler to cite this characteristic of the Mughal court, but he does emphasize it much more than others, probably because of his own context and what he hopes to do with his texts, which is to inspire conversation. Given that Bernier spent his first years with Shah Jahan in the company of Dara and Jahanara, Shah Jahan's favorite children, it's feasible to believe that this initial context, so the first years that he was in India, influenced the views of India that found their way into his text. Like her brother Dara, Jahanara was passionate about philosophy and mysticism and spent entire days studying and writing. Dara and Jahanara were themselves interested in other spiritual practices besides Islam. Like Dara and their grandfather and great-grandfather Akbar and Jahangir, Jahanara believed one could learn from other religions. Like Dara, she was especially attracted to Sufism. As Amartya Sen has recently pointed out, Dara also was very tolerant. And he recognizes his religious tolerance, explaining that in the Argumentative Indian. As you can see, Dara had learned Sanskrit, studied Hindu philosophy extensively. In fact, the presumed heir to the Mughal throne had himself translated significant parts, etc. And this translation was what was eventually known in the West. In Bernier's texts, and no doubt in conversations inspired by his texts and his experiences, India is not conflated with the Orient in general. It's not, people don't talk about Orientalism yet, or it's not conflated with the Middle East. He specifically writes only on India. Jahanara's devotion to Sufism, in fact, underscores one of the characteristics that distinguishes the Mughal harem from the more well-known version of the Ottomans. Women of different faiths inhabited the Mughal harem. Moreover, when a Mughal emperor married a Hindu woman, often to create a political alliance, she was allowed to continue to follow her own religious practices. the Mughal harem, and especially women's roles and the concept of women in society, thus took on a different hue than that of its entirely Muslim cousin in the Middle East. And through Bernier's accounts, shaped the French imaginary, inviting his contemporaries to distinguish India's harems from those in the Middle East, and more generally, the practice of Islam at the Mughal court from Constantinople. Even when Bernier describes sati, he does so differently than most of his contemporaries. He doesn't use the practice to show the barbarism of India, as will be used a lot later, but rather to illustrate the tolerance of the Mughals and also to portray women less as victims and more as reasoning subjects. Remember, Jean Chaplain asked specifically Bernier to talk about women, in part because of the French milieu. So it's interesting to note that Bernier begins his description of sati by stating that it's on its decline. And he says, I'm going to write differently. I also write about sati, as others have, and I'm sure everybody wants to know about this, but I would nevertheless have you first remark that it isn't at all as people have described, and that not as many burn themselves as in the past. The Mughals are against this barbaric custom and prevent it as much as they can because they want to allow the Hindus, and he says, le libre exercice de leur religion, the freedom to practice their religion. He explains somewhat that this is in part because the Mughals don't want to they're afraid of civil war, but that really is not the reason, because in many other places in his text, he does not associate religious freedom with fear that somehow the Hindus would just revolt. So this particular portrait of India must have really intrigued his 17th century colleagues and contemporaries. They most likely would have been tempted to compare the regime they were living under, one in which they could be expelled for even a different branch of Christianity. Religious diversity was, of course, totally banned under Louis XIV. Bernier's portrait of the religious tolerance of the Mughals might well surprise us in the 21st century, where Aurangzeb in particular is viewed as intolerant. But recent historians have begun to interrogate this history, especially the vilifying portrait of Aurangzeb. Even under Aurangzeb, the Indian landscape continued to bear the mark of the religious pluralism and tolerance associated with his ancestors. This is how he is portrayed in Bernier's texts. In Agra, for example, Jesuits constructed a church as well as a school, which existed alongside the various Hindu temples and Muslim mosques. Cantonnet des Fosses, who was a 19th century historian, wrote a number of studies of Bernier, and he describes the Mughal Empire very differently from the majority of British 19th century historians. And his assessment is based again on Bernier. And he writes, the Mughals, who were primarily Muslim, showed a fairly great tolerance. One did not see the fanatic that unfortunately is the principal quality of the Turks and the Persians. The monarch himself was an example by exhibiting his tolerance to Christians as well as Hindus. Bernier points out the religious tolerance of the great Mughal government. Cantonnet des Fosses' assessment is more in line with the conception of India that existed in Bernier's own time, one that acknowledged the acceptance of religious differences as an Indian trait, even under the rule of Aurangzeb. In a France that was more and more dominated by an absolute monarch who ruled by divine right, the example of India with its own powerful ruler and rulers, because there were many other rulers, and Bernier talks about the fact that India is not totally united. There's powerful rulers all over. But it must have been seen as a surprising example of another way of ruling, and successfully. Bernier often views India in terms of cultural relativism. He isn't judgmental, preferring instead to make his interlocutors and readers think. He begins he opens his text, and this is not included in later editions, but the first edition and the editions that were known in the 17th century before the Amsterdam edition, which is at the end of the century, he says, I'm not going to describe everything. I will try to make them known through the actions and events that I will describe. So in other words, he's going to make the reader work. This is not about him. It's about, let's talk about India in general. In fact, he does guide them, but his goal is to start conversations. He often compares Paris and France to the court that he's inhabiting, as well as to the places that he visits, but it's not with the desire to create a hierarchy. What's good for France isn't necessarily good for India, and vice versa. Now, this can seem surprising coming from someone living in 17th century France under Louis XIV, which at the time was the envy of other European countries. The third volume opens with a letter to a philosopher by the name of Le Mat-Louveillé. And the description at the top says, containing the description of Delhi and Agra, the capital cities of the empire of the Great Mughal, with some particularities that will make known the court and the character, génie, of the Mughals and the Indians. Génie is a very positive term, but it means their expertise, the character, the ways of thinking. When he gets to descriptions of Delhi and Agra, he starts by asking the question that he knows that his contemporaries are going to ask. So, are they as beautiful as Paris? And he says, well, I know that's what you're going to ask me. Without a doubt, our buildings have beautiful qualities, but these are qualities that are particular to them and must conform to a cold climate. Delhi, likewise, can have its own qualities that are particular to it and that conform to a very hot climate. So it's very, very cultural relativism is something that guides his entire way of thinking. And then he talks about homes, and people obviously in France are going to be interested, especially his noble public, and he's living in a mansion. So he's visiting various mansions in Delhi and Agra. And he said, you should know that in these hot countries, for a house to be considered beautiful, it must be practical. It must be situated in a well-ventilated place. It must have courtyards, gardens, little fountains. It's necessary for a house to be beautiful that it be situated in the middle of a garden. So it's a very, these detail gives a real sense of the génie, the genius, or the ways of thinking and living of the Mughals and Indians. So it's almost a pedagogical tone that he adopts. And when he keeps repeating beautiful and beauty in these descriptions of Indian mansions, he's forcing his readers and his contemporaries and others, perhaps, to reflect on what actually constitutes beauty, what's considered to be beautiful, not necessarily just what the French think it is. Bernier describes the boutiques in Delhi, comparing them to those in Paris. He evokes food, especially melons, mangoes, and other delicacies that would have been exotic for the French palate. And he says, I think in India, people live better. They're more healthy. They eat better than we do in France. And he says, on vit plus sainement, in a more healthy way than we do. He describes his experience with music, and this is really, no, let's stop that. And saying that when he first arrives, truth be told, when I first arrived, this music overwhelmed me so much that I found it unbearable. For a long time now, though, I find it very pleasant, especially at night when I'm in bed and I hear it playing under my terrace. I find that there's something majestic about it, and it's very melodious. As he does in all his texts, in this particular letter, but throughout the text, Bernier feeds his public's interest in these aspects of India but also in court ceremonies. He mentions the peacock throne, for example. It describes the splendid dress of the court figures, reflecting his readers' attraction to the Indian fabrics that were flooding the European market that we also just heard about in the previous talk. Bernier's principal premise throughout his text seems to be that India may be different, but it is not inferior. In fact, France and India have a lot in common. Readers can rely on Bernier's judgment. He establishes his authority by including his opinion that Paris, the beloved capital of his readers, is indeed, he quotes, and I quote, the most beautiful, the richest, the best city in the world. So his taste hasn't changed. It's simply become more elastic and more open to difference, which is the effect he perhaps wishes to have on his readers. Bernier's text inspires the public to ponder larger questions, such as the nature of beauty and cultural relativism. The portrait of India that emerges emanates from this encounter between traveler and public, between India and France, and thus has a particular hue that you don't see in any other account. India is not just an exotic other. It can even perhaps be a model for France. This perspective is especially evident when he turns to describing the Taj Mahal. And remember that Versailles, when Bernier is writing, Versailles is just in the middle of being constructed. Louis XIV starts construction in 1661 and it goes through 1680. So when Bernier describes the Taj Mahal, he emphasizes that it provokes really an intriguing and provocative examination of what is taste. This very visual portrait it says, oh, well, basically, it's nothing like we have. It's very different, and it's a very particular kind of building, but that nonetheless has something pleasant about its bizarre, meaning sense of irregular. Bizarre just means doesn't conform to normal rules, and which, in my opinion, would certainly merit a place in our books on architecture. It is almost nothing like seeing a series of arcades, yet everything appears magnificent, fairly well conceived and executed, excuse me. Nothing shocks the eye. On the contrary, everything in it shines. One cannot stop looking at it. The last time I saw it, I was with one of our French merchants, that's Tavernier, the diamond merchant, who, like me, couldn't get tired of looking at it. I didn't dare tell him my opinion because I was afraid that I had corrupted my taste, that it had become Indianized. But since he was coming directly from France, I was relieved to hear him say that he had never seen anything so majestic nor so bold in Europe. I'm not sure if my taste is a bit too Indian, but I think it merits inclusion among the world's wonders more than those misshapen masses, the Egyptian pyramids. And he repeats this later. Mumtaz Mahal's mausoleum is something marvelous. As for me, I'm still not sure if my taste is a bit too Indian. I think it merits inclusion among the world's wonders. And he mentions this numerous times. So Bernier even suggests that Westerners could learn from India, that the French could incorporate Indian norms into their own books on architecture. He refuses to say that the French norms and French taste are indeed superior. The sheer magnificence of the Taj Mahal elicits admiration and wonder, despite the fact that it is irregular, according to Western models. Neither Bernier nor Tavernier can take their eyes off of this. Bernier strategically suggests that Western taste would benefit from exposure to different norms. Inherent in his description of the Taj is the suggestion that were he to judge the Taj complex according to France's accepted notions of beauty, it might be found to be equal to or even superior to Louis XIV's own magnificent projects. This at a time, as I said, when Louis is in the middle of constructing Versailles. Bernier's texts illustrate the effect this encounter with India was having on France. French taste, in general, was being Indianized. Tavernier also describes the Taj, but if you compare the descriptions, he doesn't focus on the philosophy behind it. He doesn't think about, he just basically describes it. It's not meant to, his description is not meant to get people to think. So I'm going to end with one final distinguishing characteristic of Bernier's texts, which is throughout his depiction of India through its fabrics, through especially cottons and painted, but the French term is toile peinte, so painted cottons. There was some silk, but not much. It was primarily cottons, and that was the major import, the major thing that was imported. His interest in fabrics can be attributed to the fact that fashion under Louis XIV and was being used as a political tool by Louis XIV. He wanted to be seen as the model for all of Europe, in fact, in terms of fashion. Indienne, so these cottons in particular, and they were used by people not just of the nobility, but throughout. In fact, I'm here in Lorient, so in Brittany, and Brittany was known for the dress and cottons that they were importing from India. Everyone was wearing them. They were so comfortable and so wonderful and so beautiful. In Bernier's texts, when he describes them, these fabrics are an integral part of the Mughal court and Indian culture. In his letter to Colbert, so the finance minister, Bernier uses fabrics to give Louis's minister knowledge of India and its values. He describes the gold and silver and saying that there's in such abundance that they're used throughout India in the manufacturing of these fabrics. These fabrics are even used to construct the tents used by the court when they travel. And Bernier writes about this, saying these tents are lined with indienne or toile peinte. And they're very lengthy descriptions. And this is an example of one of the tents. The French military tents, on the other hand, were certainly not made of anything that beautiful. Fabrics illustrate India's culture. Even when traveling to its summer retreat, this court, the Indian court, like that of Bernier's French public, surrounds itself with beauty and luxury in these descriptions. Through the detailed descriptions of these unique and luxurious fabrics, the Mughal court and the India that produces these marvels enter the French imaginary as places of a superior order of life. Cotton and silk are not just commodities. Their production has been raised to a level of artistry that does not exist elsewhere, not even in Europe. A civilization that devotes such effort to these creations and with such success elicits respect, admiration, and even envy. Bernier evokes this world through the richness of its materials because these indiennes were already admired and in high demand in France. Indian toile peinte or fabrics were not just popular. The French public could not get enough of these fantastic fabrics. The French public's attraction to indienne, nourished in part and promoted by Bernier, illustrates that 17th century French taste was being influenced by Indian culture. This proved to be problematic for the Sun King, Louis XIV, who wanted to impose French style and taste on his subjects, but also on Europe. France was not producing the most desirable fabrics and could not compete with India in this arena. This fact affected not only France's vision of itself, but also the image that it wished to construct as the capital of style for the world. Bernier's descriptions of toile peinte or painted fabrics in India both reflected and helped to impose this foreign taste. And since fabrics were synonymous with India's sophistication and refinement, India as a culture was also elevated in the minds of Bernier's contemporaries. Louis's reaction to this passion for indienne is an effort to suppress this taste for India. By the 1680s, so this is 10 years after Bernier's texts were first produced, The taste for India was increasingly seen by Louis XIV as disruptive, controversial, and decidedly anti-French, even treasonous. In 1686, so 2 years after he banned Protestants, Louis officially banned all the importation of all printed and painted Indian textiles. For many economists today, the bans, which other countries also later institute, were designed to protect indigenous European fabric industries. But I don't agree that that's exactly what's happening here. Louis' bans were instituted earlier and went much farther, and they also lasted 100 years. Unlike the British, for example, Louis not only prohibited the importation of Indian Indienne, the painted and printed fabrics, he also forbade the imitation of Indienne by French companies. So the French couldn't even make their own. In fact, he outlawed the buying, selling, of wearing of Indienne and toile peinte and their imitation. And he made it illegal to even import plain white cotton from India, because as all the edicts say, he felt that the fabrics would only be used for printing and creating these banned fabrics. So Louis used all the powers in his arsenal to combat this taste, even prohibiting painters or artists from depicting Indienne in their portraits. Louis was reacting to the taste for these prints and even taste for India as a whole. As these examples illustrate, in Bernier's text and in the conversations his text inspired, India is not an inferior other that France was determined to colonize. Rather, Bernier suggests that his own culture would benefit from exposure to this different culture that he posits as equal in many ways to his own. The conversations around this text inspired the public to think in different ways, to question the imposition of one taste, one standard of behavior, or even one religion, which was more and more the case under Louis XIV's absolutist policies. So when we replace English culture and history as the sole lens through which we examine early modern contacts with India and reject a preconceived notion of the Orient, we can hear a very different conversation between East and West. The end. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah. Stop sharing.
There.
That was a really insightful and engaging talk and gave a unique perspective, the salon perspective to the writings of Bernier. I'll now have Gopu from Tamil Heritage Trust to moderate the question answer session.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
It was a wonderful lecture. There are several aspects of it that are very new to a lot of us. The centrality of fabrics, Voltaire's comment, the way Bernier studied Indian society. Did he travel outside the Mughal Empire when he visited India, or was it confined to Delhi, Agra, etc.?
No, he did go down to Golconda with Tavernier. The two of them went to the diamond mines. So that's as far south as he got, unfortunately. I would love it if he had gotten as far as Chennai or really to South India. That's the India I know. So I was really hoping he would get, but he does talk. He's one of the few who really tries to talk about Hinduism and Hindu practices, and tries to get out of or at least broaden his understanding. He doesn't always get it right by any means, but he does at least address issues outside of the Mughal court.
We saw that, I think it was Jean Chapelain who mentioned that he should study the art, the sculptor, the local, manufacturing, little art crafts, traditions, all of those that did he write about any of those? Did
Yes.
Bernier write about any of those?
He does. He does in the first two volumes, because those first two volumes are really especially the Événements particuliers, so the second volume of the Aurangzeb's court, it's not really politics that he's talking about. He picks up on what it's like to live in India. I mean, he'll talk, for example, about how merchants can live, and he does this even better than Tavernier. And Tavernier, as I said, does write a manual when he's in India of how you can deal with the diamond merchants, with the precious gem merchants, etc. But his text really is much more of a description for other merchants to follow. Bernier will talk about merchants, for example, but he'll talk about, oh, isn't it wonderful that Jahanara, for example, built these caravanserai, so these rest places for the merchants. We should have these kinds of hotel. They're almost like a hotel type place. We should have these in Europe that would make travelers much more safe. So when he compares, he tends to put things in a broader picture. But yes, he doesn't obey Chaplin as much as I'm sure Chaplin would have liked, because he's his own person. But one of the letters that he writes that is published, that he decides to publish, is another letter to Chaplin, and he talks in particular in that one. That's the one that's most on religion, but he also talks about superstition, and whereas many travelers at the time equated Indian religions and any religion that was not Christian with superstition, Bernier does exactly the opposite and says, well, he has to be very careful, but he says, listen, Christianity has its own, there are traits that make Christianity as superstitious as we tend to think other religions might be. And he uses the example of the comet. Because in the 1660s there was a comet, so it was Halley's comet, I think, and he talks about the reaction in India and the reaction because he was in India, but the reaction also in France. And he said, look, it's basically the same reaction. Everyone is subject to superstition, anyway.
Okay, I'll go for an audience question. There's Chakravarti Bharati who asks, did Bernier's travel account influence French writers and poets like Rousseau, Baudelaire, Racine, etc.?
I think his accounts definitely influenced Voltaire. Voltaire uses him through the 18th century, uses him as the major source. By the 19th century, you had so many other travelers who were going to India, but going especially to the Middle East, and a real interest in Orientalism. And India gets kind of pushed to the side and conflated. And so someone like Baudelaire is not so much influenced in the 19th century, those poets are not so much influenced by India as by this general notion of, or general thing of the Orient, especially China. There's much more exchange, and India kind of takes more of a, intellectuals are very interested in the text, the knowledge base of India. So you have through the 18th century, you have a lot of people translating the sacred texts in particular, along with the Germans. But the poets, not so much in the 19th century.
I kind of like the remark about the buildings that he made, that brings out what you talk about as tolerance or acceptance of a different mode. He says the hot climate of Delhi requires a different kind of building and architecture than you'd expect from Paris, and that shows a extraordinarily broad mind. I just quickly quip that Dr. Kumud Kanikar says like this talk and this program itself feels like a French salon. It's an intellectual discussion.
Great. That's very nice.
And somebody else asks, did he write about ordinary Indians or only about the royals?
No, he writes about ordinary Indians. In particular, for example, when he describes Sati, there he's talking about ordinary Indians. And he talks about merchants. He talks about visiting the bazaar, and so he talks about he is at the court, but he goes outside the court. As I said, he's most interested in getting a sense of how people live and how people think. So he doesn't limit himself to the court at all. As I said, I wish he had spent more time, been able to spend more time in the South, because I do think that his way of approaching especially Hindu society is a bit more limited because he doesn't have the access, nor do I believe he knew the language in the same way that he knew the language at the court. So I think that limits his knowledge, and his ability to really, but he's interested and he tries.
I think your talk would encourage people to go read up Bernier. The problem is most of us are familiar with English because of British colonization and not of French. So
I know, this is the problem.
You read the
Yeah.
books in French?
Yeah, I do it entirely in French. That's my main one of my main points is I was so shocked to I did all my research and everything has been in French. I mean, that's been my life for 40 years. And I went to the English texts because I didn't understand how historians, et cetera, if we were talking about the same text. I was trying to find their references in the English version. And that's when I discovered that it's just not the same. It's not translated as the French. It's translated into 19th century French. So it's as though, and it's not even the full text that's translated. And those are the texts that everybody is still using. So it's really a shame. I do need, hopefully I retire soon and I can do a translation. I do need there needs to be, we had certain translations of certain parts. And my first book, so the one that's in English, Versailles Meets the Taj Mahal, that was published by Toronto. That book, I do all my own translations. So that has the correct French, but also the correct English translations based on my interpretation of the French language at the time, because that's the difference also. Things like race changes from the 17th century in French, race, and Bernier talks about different races. Well, by the 19th century, people are now saying, oh, well, he's introduced racism into what, so he's the origin of this concept of racism. It's not at all. Race, in the way it is used in the 17th century, means it is a way of classifying people, but according to family and lineage. It's much more tied to that. It has nothing to do with skin color, etc. It has to do with where you are and your family lineage. So that's an example of how this misinterpretation can often happen through translation.
Okay.
But I need a little more time to do the more translation. But the other book.
Oh no, I think yeah. So for example, we heard about Biruni a couple of days back and all his scientific writings. We couldn't barely even touch that today. So I mean, we are getting a sample of what the travelers' accounts are. We're obviously not getting a comprehensive. That's a very big book, right? I mean, 3 volumes. That's a lot. So understandable. Ravi Shankar asks, and as a avid fan of the pyramids of Egypt, Do you think it was very uncharitable to call them unshapen masses compared?
The reason he's doing that, and yes, he's joking in a way, but not really, because those are the things that conform to French classical style, right? The French classicism or the French models of architecture, what's considered to be beautiful, is based on Greece and Rome. I mean, that's the model. So what he's saying is, listen, those models are not the only most beautiful models. I think but he's shocking people in saying what he's rejecting is the Western set of architectural values that had always dominated what was considered to be acceptable or especially beautiful, and turning that on its head. And yes, I think it goes too far by saying they should just trash them. But it's really to get his readers and his public, get their attention and to make a point, a larger point. I think he still likes the pyramids. He did visit Cairo, so.
Prabhakar asks, does he refer to any Indian literature? Did he have access to did he study any of that?
He did read he mentioned the only things that he really mentions are the sacred texts. I mean, that he's in touch with or he hears about. Reading, I'm not so sure how much he read. He encountered things like and this is a text also that was known more and more in France at the time, the Panchatantra. So, and those became La Fontaine, with whom he was living in Madame la Sablier's salon in her mansion. La Fontaine, in his second volume of fables, says that he does that all of he's inspired in part, primarily for the second volume of fables by, he calls him Bidpai savant indien. So he's saying, I took these texts, which are the Panchatantra, and those are the ones that inspire me the most. And that's through Bernier. Bernier introduces him to those texts. So that's a clear tie. That's a very good question. I have to go back and look. I don't think he mentions much other literature. He's very interested in science. He discusses astronomy and astrology a lot, and belief systems are things that interest him. Where I think he's getting most of that information from conversations with people. And conversation in general was one of the major ways that people transmitted knowledge, both in France and in India, I think. You didn't necessarily write things. And as I said, we can't even limit Bernier's influence to the written text, because he was able to discuss these texts so much that there are traces of his texts in other people's texts, but that don't conform, that don't refer specifically back to his texts. Fontenelle, who was another philosopher and was part of that salon, writes a whole book on suspicion, for example. No question, he was in discussion with Bernier, and but we don't really talk about intertextuality in the same way, because there is this interface of conversation.
You made an interesting comment about his observation on music, that he didn't like it at the beginning, but it grew on him and he started enjoying it and it became melodious. I have a very Indian perspective question on this, in the sense that the harmonium, which is a very European instrument, it has become an integral part of classical music in the North. I was just wondering if you mentioned anything before the harmonium, or was it introduced in this period,
No.
or other instruments there?
No,
Mm.
I don't know. That's a really good question. Very interesting. No, I don't know. He didn't mention, he was just talking in general about um, comparing various aspects of Indian and French life that he knew would be of interest to his public. And music is, of course, a major part of French culture at the time. And the French obviously thought that their music was the absolute best. And so for him to say, well, I find it very, especially the use of his term majestic. I thought that, I mean, and that's the French too, majesté, which of course would have certain resonances with his French public. Other times he'll use the descriptor royal. He talks about what is it? I think it's the Taj. Il y a quelque chose de royal, something royal about it. For his 17th century public, under Louis XIV, they're automatically going to compare with Louis. And so that he loves to play with language like that too, which is one of the advantages of being, I mean, my specialty, yes, I'm an historian, but I was trained as a literary I teach literature primarily. So I read his text not just for what they say, but for how he says it, what his word choice, right? Which adds another dimension, I think. And to me, Bernier, as a philosopher, was somebody who was very conscious of the way that he is using language. He also had to be because he was living under a ruler who, if your text had to go through the king in order to be published. So that's also why you have to read it at different degrees and see it as being addressed to different people in different ways.
One audience member, RD, asks, is 17th century French very different from present day French? I would add, would it be as different as, say, Shakespeare in English versus today's English or something like that?
No, that's a very good question. No, it's not. It's very similar. The usage, though, you do have to be careful because the usage, as I was describing with the word race, for example, can be different. But the actual structure of the language and the vocabulary is not much different, in part because as of 1634, Richelieu founded the French Academy. And one of the goals of the French Academy was to make the French language standardize it. And Louis XIV took over the French Academy in 1670, so the same time as Bernier's writing, in part because, and he says this, one of the reasons it's so important that the French language be standardized, but also that that people be able to read in the future how wonderful he was. So he's very conscious of the future, and he knows that his reputation, that knowledge about Louis XIV is going to be through historians, is going to be through texts, and it'll be through language, not conversation, but the written language. So he wants to control the written language also. So that when I teach 17th century text and the literature, I don't have to teach it in translation into a modern French version as you would in the 16th century. 17th century, you think of Molière's plays, for example. They are still produced in the French language, in the same French language. And in fact, French today is called la langue de Molière. When you refer to the French language, you call it Molière's language because it's the same. It's basically the same. Yes, there are some words that change, but or some obviously language changes from over 300 years, but it's not at all like Shakespeare. Which I have a hard time understanding as an American. Yeah.
Somebody else asks, it was fascinating to read that the French were threatened by Indian fashion. We think of France as perhaps the center of Western fashion,
Yeah.
perhaps even globally, that's the brand. French fashion is the leading. And 200 years, 300 years back, they went to the
Yes.
extent of banning Indian textiles. That
Yes.
seems
Yes.
so ridiculous.
And the East India Company, the French East India Company said, "What? You can't do that. You can't ban this." I mean, that's how we make our money. We can't. I mean, it's not by diamonds that we're selling entirely to the king that we're going to be. We can't continue to. And Louis XIV did not back down on this. And it wasn't that the French felt threatened. It was only Louis XIV. Because fashion at that point, really, he was using it as a political tool. He would dress, for example, in such a way that, and of course he had the whole court around him, that if he changed so much as the way that he wore ribbons or something like that, and somebody didn't follow suit and imitate him, then he would say, "Where have you been? I can tell you we're not here. You needed to, you're out of fashion." And that was a very serious thing to be out of fashion at the court of Louis XIV. So Europe in general also, in particular, I have a few quotations from people from a few countries right around France at the time, people saying, well, everybody follows everything that the French do in terms of fashion. So that was also it. He did not want people following anything that was not French fashion, brocades, wool, etc. But the French public, in particular women, and I go into this in great depth in the books. The whole fourth chapter is on this. So, because I love this. I mean, I obviously love Indian fabrics. So, the French women continued to defy Louis XIV. And they just said, well, what are you going to do? I mean, and so he would stop women in the streets and fine them. He had his police actually stop people. And here in Lorient, we have a whole so what was it? I don't know what the word is in English now. A woman who was stopped and condemned to prison for 4 years because she was wearing indienne. And she was not noble at all. The noble women started moving all these inside. So Mademoiselle La Sablière, we know, in the salon, she decorated with indienne. And Madame de Sévigné, who wrote letters that we now use to know what was going on in the 17th century. Sévigné writes constantly about how much people loved indienne, and she writes to her daughter and says, "Oh, thank you so much for managing to get me some indienne," which are the fabrics. People continued to try, but the bans were not lifted until Madame de Pompadour. So Louis the 15th in the 1750s finally. They were lifted, but there are many French fabrics industries, especially or manufacturers, especially in Normandy, for example, who said, "But we're making imitation indienne, and they sell. Why can't we continue to do this?" And he says, "No, absolutely not." And they end up going to Switzerland, which is interesting. So the Swiss continue manufacturing fake indienne because at that point they don't know how to keep the fabrics or the prints, especially the dyes. They don't have the same dyes. They cannot make them the same way. It's not until the 1620s, 1630s that they start to understand how to make them.
That sounds remarkably similar to the Roman empires. You have writers like Pliny and Strabo complaining about India draining their trade, people falling for Indian fashion. And we see in the late 18th century and early 19th century England, they're banning cotton, they're putting taxes on importing cotton textiles, wearing chins. And then, in Indian independence movement, Gandhi wearing the cloth and boycotting the textiles. So the textiles have a very important aspect in history. We study this as Indians. We study this part. We don't study or we are not very familiar with the other part. Was it just textiles? Were there other things? Were they worried about how the food was? The spices were corrupting the taste or something like that. Were they worried about jewelry and things like that?
The jewelry. The diamonds in particular, Europe, all the diamonds came from India. In the 17th century, there were none they hadn't discovered them yet, even in Africa or all of them came from. And that was not considered to be the most precious gem simply because they were so rare until Louis XIV and Tavernier, who brings them all back. But Louis does something that Tavernier doesn't agree with, which is Tavernier brings back these diamonds that are often 175 carats, right? And Louis XIV cuts them down. And Tavernier has a fit because for him, the value in part is the size. And Louis, and I talk about this also in the book, but Louis, and to me, he appropriates them. And then he cuts them down and makes them shinier. But he also makes it so that no one, you had to get permission from Louis XIV to have your own diamonds. He wants them all. And same thing with gold thread in fabrics, for example. You were not allowed to wear them, any fabrics with gold or silver, unless you got permission from the king, and he didn't give it very often. So it really is a control. The spices were already coming in the 16th century. And the spices under Louis XIV become less interesting. French foods, the French way of cooking and eating changes in part because they don't need to cover up the flavor as much, which is what they were doing a lot in the 16th century. And he also uses food in a different way. But I like Bernier's mentioning, saying, well, I think that the Indians eat, they eat in a more healthy way, or they live more they're more healthy when they eat, which I found very surprising. So.
Okay, thank you for answering so many questions. Thank you, the audience, for staying on and asking so many questions. There's still more questions we can't ask. We'll pass them on to you, and if you answer them, we'll share them in our website.
I'd be glad to answer anything. So people can get me by email. I'm happy to answer questions. So it was very nice. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you, Faith. It was really a delightful talk and really, really nice to have you and really nice to meet you. And it was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your help.
Yeah. Thank you to the audience for staying so patiently and listening to our 2 talks today. Tomorrow, we have 2 more wonderful talks lined up. We have A Tale of Two Travelers, Afnasi Nikitin and Carsten Niebuhr, to be delivered by Dr. Kurush F. Dalal. And then the second talk of the day, Fort St. George to Srirangapatna, Lady Clive's Journey 1800, to be delivered by Dr. Jennifer Hose. We hope to see all of you tomorrow. And good night to all of you. Good night.